Hello there and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as evening settles in? A cozy corner where the day's weight is finally lifting? Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore one of the most dramatic economic collapses in modern history, the 1997 Asian financial crisis, and discover how the quote to Suzuyu became a nightmare almost overnight, how millionaires became paupers in a matter of weeks, and how entire nations that had seemed invincible found themselves on their knees. We'll meet the people who lived through it, walk the streets of transformed cities, and slowly, carefully, piece together how prosperity turned to panic. If you enjoy these calm explorations of financial history, a like and subscribe really helps. And to those already here, thank you. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath. Let's begin. Let's begin in the early 1960s when much of Asia was poor, recovering, and looking toward an uncertain future. The Second World War had ended fewer than 20 years before. The scars were still visible, still fresh. Japan had been devastated by atomic bombs and firebombing, its cities reduced to ash and rubble. Korea had just emerged from a brutal civil war that killed millions and left the peninsula divided, with South Korea one of the poorest countries on earth. Taiwan was where the defeated nationalist Chinese had fled, an island fortress unsure of its future. Hong Kong was a British colony, crowded with refugees. Singapore had just separated from Malaysia, a tiny city-state with no natural resources and uncertain prospects. Thailand, Malaysia and Indonesia were newly independent nations trying to find their way after decades of colonial rule. This was the starting point. Not prosperity, not confidence, but poverty and uncertainty. In South Korea in 1961, per capita income was lower than many African nations. Most Koreans were subsistence farmers. They had experienced occupation, war and division. The future looked bleak. But something remarkable was about to happen. Something that would transform not just these countries, but the entire global economy. Something that economists would later call the East Asian miracle. Let's understand what made this miracle miraculous, because it's important to grasp just how extraordinary the transformation was, how rapid, how unexpected. The model was Japan. In the 1950s and 60s, Japan had risen from the ashes of defeat to become an economic powerhouse. Japanese companies, Sony, Toyota, Honda, were becoming global brands. Japanese manufacturing was synonymous with quality and innovation. The world watched in amazement as a country that had been utterly destroyed rebuilt itself into the world's second largest economy. And other Asian countries looked at Japan and thought, if they can do it, why can't we? The strategy they adopted was export-oriented industrialization. Make goods that the world wants to buy. Start with simple things, textiles, toys, basic electronics, and gradually move up the value chain. Use your comparative advantage, abundant, hard-working, increasingly educated labour, to compete with Western manufacturers, and crucially, invite foreign investment to bring capital, technology, and expertise. South Korea under Park Chung-hee pursued this aggressively. The government identified key industries and supported them through subsidies, protected markets and favourable loans. Family-owned conglomerates called chaebol, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Daewoo, became the engines of growth. They started making textiles and simple consumer goods, then moved into shipbuilding, automobiles, electronics, semiconductors. Taiwan followed a similar path, though with smaller, more nimble companies. Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew became a hub for multinational corporations, offering political stability, educated workforce, strategic location, and business-friendly policies. Hong Kong thrived as a financial centre and trading port. Thailand focused on textiles, tourism and agricultural exports. Malaysia developed its palm oil, rubber and electronic sectors. Indonesia, blessed with oil and natural gas, used resource wealth to fund development. But the strategy alone wasn't enough. What really made the difference was the commitment to education. These countries invested heavily in schooling. Literacy rates soared. Universities expanded. Students were sent abroad to study engineering, business, science, and returned home to apply their knowledge. Parents who were farmers or factory workers sacrificed enormously to ensure their children got education. Education became the pathway to a better life, and that pathway was real. Not just a dream, and it worked. The numbers were staggering, almost unbelievable. Through the 1970s and 80s, these economies grew at rates of 7, 8, 9, sometimes 10% annually, year after year, compounding, doubling in size every 7 or 8 years. South Korea's per capita income went from under $100 in 1960 to over $10,000 by 1995. Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong achieved similar transformations. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, while starting from lower bases, were growing almost as fast. Poverty rates plummeted. In 1960, most South Koreans lived in poverty. By 1990, poverty was becoming rare. Life expectancy increased dramatically. From the 50s to the 70s, infant mortality fell. People were living longer, healthier, more prosperous lives. The World Bank published a study in 1993 titled The East Asian Miracle, trying to understand what had happened, what lessons could be learned. These weren't just good economic performances. These were transformations unlike anything seen since perhaps the Industrial Revolution. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like at the human level, because statistics don't capture the reality of transformation. Imagine a family in South Korea in 1960. The father is a rice farmer. Working land his family has worked for generations. The work is back-breaking, the income barely enough to survive. They live in a small house with a dirt floor. They eat rice and kimchi, occasionally fish, rarely meat. There's no electricity in their village, no running water. Life is hard, prospects limited. Now imagine that same family in 1990. The father still farms, but his son has moved to Seoul. The son works in a Samsung factory, assembling televisions. He lives in an apartment with electricity, running water, a refrigerator. He owns a television, one he helped make. His children go to good schools. His daughter is studying at university, learning English and computer science. The family has risen from poverty to middle class in a single generation. This wasn't one story. This was millions of stories. Tens of millions. People whose parents had been subsistence farmers became factory workers, became engineers, became managers, became entrepreneurs. The transformation was so rapid that generations within the same family lived in completely different worlds. Cities transformed just as dramatically. Bangkok in 1960 was a modest city of perhaps 2 million people, still with many canals giving it a Venice-like quality, with temples and traditional wooden houses. By 1995, it was a metropolis of over 6 million, with high-rise office towers, shopping malls, elevated highways, a growing middle class, traffic jams that rivaled Los Angeles. Seoul in 1960 was still recovering from war, its buildings low, its streets often unpaved. By 1990, it was a modern city of skyscrapers, subways, electronic stores selling the latest gadgets, restaurants serving every cuisine imaginable. The skyline at night glittered with neon and fluorescent lights, a symbol of prosperity and modernity. Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, Manila, all experienced similar explosions of growth and development. Construction cranes dominated skylines. New airports were built, then expanded again. Hotels, office buildings, shopping complexes rose on land that had recently been rice paddies or kampongs. The middle class was emerging, and with it came consumer culture. Families who had never owned a car were buying their first vehicles. Department stores sold refrigerators, washing machines, air conditioners, televisions, VCRs. Young people wore jeans and listened to pop music and dreamed of travelling abroad. Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's opened franchises. Hollywood movies played in modern cineplexes. This was prosperity as many had never known it. The older generation, who remembered poverty and war and hardship, could hardly believe what was happening. Their children, who had grown up with rising living standards, took it for granted, expected it to continue forever. Foreign investment poured in. Multinational corporations built factories to take advantage of skilled, affordable labour. Japanese companies moved production to Southeast Asia. American and European firms followed. The investments brought not just capital but technology transfer, management expertise, access to global markets. Tourism boomed, especially in Thailand. Visitors from Europe, America, Japan, Australia came to experience exotic cultures, beautiful beaches, ancient temples, delicious food. The tourism industry created jobs in hotels, restaurants, tour companies, shops. Young people in rural areas moved to tourist centres like Phuket or Chiang Mai, finding work that paid better than farming ever had. The financial sectors grew alongside the real economy. Banks expanded, offering loans for businesses, mortgages for homes, credit cards for consumers. Stock markets were established or expanded. In 1975, the Thai stock market barely existed. By 1995, it was a modern exchange with hundreds of listed companies, with ordinary people investing their savings in hopes of benefiting from continued growth. Governments took pride in their achievements. Leaders like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia, and the succession of leaders in South Korea and Taiwan became international figures, touted as examples of effective governance. The Quote 2 model, where government actively guided economic development while maintaining largely capitalist economies, seemed to be working brilliantly. There was talk of Asian values, of Confucian work ethic, of why Asian economies were succeeding where others had failed. Some of this was self-congratulation. Some of it was search for cultural explanation for economic success. But underneath it all was a genuine sense of achievement and pride. Asia was no longer the poor, backwards continent it had been portrayed as. Asia was rising, modernizing, becoming a force in the global economy. By the mid-1990s, the confidence was at its peak. South Korea joined the OECD in 1996, the club of rich, developed nations. It was a moment of tremendous national pride. Korea had arrived. It was no longer a developing country. It was developed. The Asian Development Bank projected continued strong growth. The World Bank and IMF praised the economic management of these countries. Investors were pouring money into the region, convinced that Asian growth was the surest bet in the world. Mutual funds marketed themselves on their Asia exposure. Business magazines ran cover stories about the Asian century, about how the 21st century would belong to Asia, the way the 20th had belonged to America. But underneath all this gleaming prosperity, underneath the skyscrapers and the shopping malls and the stock market gains, there were cracks forming. Vulnerabilities that few people noticed, or if they noticed, they dismissed as minor concerns that wouldn't matter as long as growth continued. The currencies of these countries were pegged to the US dollar, meaning they maintained fixed exchange rates. If you were a Thai business person, you knew that the baht would always be about 25 to the dollar. This stability seemed like a strength. It made trade predictable. It made borrowing in dollars seem safe. But this peg created a hidden danger. Because if you could borrow dollars at low American interest rates and invest in Thailand at high Thai interest rates, you could make money on the difference, as long as the exchange rate stayed fixed. This is exactly what many people did. Thai banks and companies borrowed billions of dollars from abroad. Korean chaebol financed their expansion with dollar loans. Indonesian developers built office towers and shopping malls with borrowed dollars. As long as the pegs held, this seemed fine. But pegs are promises, and promises can be broken. Real estate prices were rising rapidly, especially in Thailand. Bangkok in the mid-1990s experienced a building boom that filled the skyline with construction cranes. Office buildings, luxury condominiums, shopping centres, all being built simultaneously, all financed with borrowed money, much of it in dollars. The assumption was that demand would continue to grow, that prices would keep rising, that the boom would never end. Stock markets were similarly elevated. Price-to-earnings ratios that would have worried investors in New York or London were dismissed in Bangkok and Seoul as reflecting the higher growth rates. Companies with questionable profitability were valued as if future success was guaranteed, and exports, which had driven the miracle, were slowing. The Japanese yen had weakened in 1995, making Japanese exports more competitive. China had devalued its currency in 1994, making Chinese goods cheaper. Thailand's export growth, which had been roaring along at double digits, slowed to near zero in 1996. Current account deficits, the gap between what a country imports and exports, were widening. These warning signs were there. Some economists pointed them out. Some investors grew nervous. But in the atmosphere of confidence and continued growth, the warnings were drowned out. The miracle had lasted 30 years. Why should it end now? Every previous dip had been temporary. Every concern had proven overblown. The Asian model worked. Just keep faith, and everything would be fine. In the summer of 1997, Asia stood at a peak. Decades of growth, of transformation, of rising prosperity. Cities that gleamed with modernity. A new middle class confident in its future. Governments proud of their achievements. Investors convinced that Asia was the place to be. The view from that peak was magnificent. But what no one could see, what almost no one imagined, was how quickly you could fall from such heights. How suddenly confidence could turn to panic. How rapidly the miracle could become a nightmare. The storm was gathering. Though the sky still seemed clear, and when it broke, it would sweep away fortunes, destroy dreams, and teach lessons that would echo for decades. Let that image rest in your mind for a moment. Asia at its peak, confident and proud, unaware of what was about to unfold. But let's step back now, back to the early and mid-1990s, and look more carefully at the foundation of all this prosperity. Because when you examine it closely, when you understand how the system actually worked, you begin to see vulnerabilities that weren't obvious from the surface. The currencies of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea and others were pegged to the US dollar. This meant their central banks promised to maintain a fixed exchange rate. The Thai baht, for instance, was kept at around 25 to the dollar. The Indonesian rupiah at around 2,400 to the dollar, the Korean won at around 800 to the dollar. On the surface, this seemed like a strength. It provided stability and predictability. If you were a Thai company exporting goods to America, you knew exactly how many baht you'd receive for your dollars. If you were an American investor putting money into Thailand, you didn't have to worry about exchange rate fluctuations eating into your returns. The peg was a promise of stability. But maintaining a peg requires something crucial. Enough foreign currency reserves to defend it if people start doubting the promise. And defending a peg becomes harder when you open your economy to free flows of capital. When you allow money to move in and out of your country without restrictions. This was the situation by the mid-1990s. Most of these countries had liberalised their capital accounts, making it easy for foreign money to flow in and, crucially, to flow back out. Combined with currency pegs, this created what economists would later recognise as a dangerous combination. But at the time, it seemed like a mark of sophistication, of joining the modern global economy, and the money was flowing in, billions and billions of dollars, because the math was seductive. Imagine you're a banker in Tokyo or New York in 1995. Interest rates in Japan are near zero. Interest rates in America are maybe 5 or 6%, but interest rates in Thailand are 12%, in Indonesia 15%. The returns are much higher. And because the currencies are pegged to the dollar, it seems like there's no currency risk. You can borrow yen or dollars at low rates, lend in Thailand or Indonesia at high rates, and pocket the difference. It's called the carry trade, and it seemed like free money. Thai banks and finance companies were the intermediaries. They borrowed dollars from abroad, short-term loans often due in just a few months or a year. Then they lent that money domestically for long-term projects, office buildings, shopping malls, luxury condominiums. This maturity mismatch, borrowing short to lend long, is always risky. But as long as foreign lenders kept rolling over the loans, as long as they kept providing new money when the old loans came due, it worked. The Korean chaebol were doing something similar. These massive family-owned conglomerates were expanding aggressively. Daewoo was building car factories around the world. Hyundai was entering new industries. They needed capital, and borrowing dollars was cheaper than borrowing won. By 1997, Korean companies had accumulated well over $100 billion in foreign debt. Much of it was short-term. Much of it was unhedged, meaning there was no protection if the exchange rate changed. But why would the exchange rate change? The won was pegged, the government had promised, and the government had kept that promise for years. Trust the peg, borrow the cheap dollars, expand and prosper. That was the logic. Indonesian companies and banks followed the same pattern. The rupiah was stable against the dollar. Suharto's government, which had ruled for 3 decades, seemed unshakable. Borrow dollars, invest domestically, profit. What could go wrong? And all this borrowed money was flowing into real estate and stock markets, inflating asset prices to levels that, in hindsight, were clearly unsustainable bubbles. Let's talk about Bangkok's building boom, because it became a symbol of the excess. In the early 1990s, Bangkok was already growing rapidly, but the pace accelerated to something almost frenzied by mid-decade. Construction cranes dominated the skyline. At the peak, there were reportedly more cranes in Bangkok than in any other city in the world. Office towers were rising in clusters. Luxury condominium projects were launched monthly. Shopping centres, each larger and more lavish than the last, competed for customers. The construction was financed with borrowed money. Much of it in dollars. Developers assumed that Bangkok's growth would continue, that all this space would be filled with tenants and buyers, that property values would keep rising. Banks and finance companies, flush with cheap foreign money, lent eagerly. After all, real estate was a safe investment, everyone said. Land is limited, population is growing, prosperity is increasing. Prices can only go up. Except they were building faster than demand could absorb. By 1996, Bangkok had office vacancy rates approaching 20%. There was already more space than tenants, but construction continued because projects already started had to be finished, and new projects kept getting approved and financed. The same pattern was visible in Seoul, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur. Gleaming towers in business districts, luxury apartments in the suburbs, shopping malls so enormous they became tourist attractions themselves. All built with borrowed money, all assuming continued growth, all vulnerable to any slowdown. Stock markets were equally elevated. The Thai stock market had soared through the early 90s. Same with Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia. Foreign investors poured money in through mutual funds and pension funds attracted by high returns. Local investors, seeing stocks only rise, borrowed money to buy more stocks, convinced this was the path to wealth. Companies with questionable fundamentals, high debt, low profitability, uncertain business models saw their stock prices triple or quadruple. The standard measures of valuation that might signal overpricing were dismissed. This is Asia, people said. Growth rates are higher here. Different rules apply. The old Western metrics don't capture the dynamism of Asian economies. There was an element of truth in this. Asian economies were growing faster. But there were also elements of delusion, of believing that gravity somehow didn't apply, that markets could rise forever without correction. And then exports, which had driven everything, started to slow. The warning signs appeared in 1996. Thailand's export growth, which had been over 20% annually in the early 90s, slowed to nearly flat. Several factors combined to create this slowdown. The Japanese yen had appreciated significantly in the early 90s, making Japanese exports expensive. But in 1995, the yen began weakening again. As it fell against the dollar, and since Asian currencies were pegged to the dollar, it meant they were rising against the yen. Suddenly, Japanese exports became more competitive again, and Thai or Malaysian or Korean exports became relatively more expensive to Japanese buyers. China added to the competitive pressure. In 1994, China had devalued its currency, the yuan, by about 33%. This made Chinese exports dramatically cheaper. Manufacturers across Asia found themselves losing market share to Chinese competitors. There was also a global glut in electronics, a key export sector for many Asian economies. Too much capacity, too much production. Prices falling. Companies that had invested billions in electronics manufacturing found profit margins shrinking. Thailand's current account deficit, the gap between what it imported and exported, widened to 8% of GDP by 1996. This meant Thailand was importing far more than it was exporting, financing the gap with foreign borrowing. As long as foreign lenders kept lending, this could continue, but it was fundamentally unsustainable. The Thai government and central bank knew there was a problem. By late 1996, they were quietly concerned. Finance companies were starting to show signs of trouble. Some had made too many bad loans to property developers, and with the real estate market softening, those loans were going sour. In the spring of 1997, the government would quietly close 10 finance companies, trying to prevent problems from spreading. But they didn't want to alarm markets. They continued to defend the baht's peg to the dollar, spending foreign reserves to buy baht whenever selling pressure appeared. They made reassuring statements that everything was under control, that Thailand's fundamentals were sound, that any problems were temporary and manageable. Some voices were raising concerns. Economists pointed to the vulnerabilities, the high foreign debt, the real estate bubble, the export slowdown, the current account deficit. A few hedge fund managers began to wonder if the currency pegs could hold, but these warnings were largely ignored or dismissed, because the boom was still visible. The shopping malls were still crowded, new cars were still being bought. Stock markets, while more volatile than before, were still near their highs. GDP growth, while slowing from the incredible rates of earlier years, was still respectable. On the surface, everything looked fine, and there was a powerful psychological resistance to believing anything could go seriously wrong. The miracle had lasted 3 decades. Asia had weathered challenges before: oil shocks, regional political instability, global recessions, and kept growing. This faith was built on real achievements, on lived experience of rising prosperity. Why should it end now? Moreover, there was a sense of exceptionalism. Asian economies were different. People believed. The developmental state model worked. The strong family structures, the Confucian values, the high savings rates, the commitment to education, these created a foundation that Western economies lacked. The rules that applied to Latin America or Eastern Europe or other emerging markets didn't apply to Asia. Asia was special. This confidence was reinforced by international institutions. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank generally praised Asian economic management. Credit rating agencies gave high marks to Asian governments and corporations. Foreign investors kept flowing money in. If there were serious problems, surely these sophisticated institutions would warn of them. But there had been a warning from recent history that should have given pause: the Mexican peso crisis of 1994 to 1995. Mexico had experienced its own boom in the early 90s, with foreign investment flowing in, stock market rising, optimism high. Mexico's currency was managed rather than fully pegged, but the principle was similar. The government promised stability. And like the Asian countries, Mexico had borrowed heavily in dollars, had a large current account deficit, had asset bubbles in stocks and real estate. In December 1994, the Mexican government was forced to devalue the peso. The currency collapsed, falling from about 3 pesos per dollar to over 7. Capital fled. The economy plunged into recession. Unemployment soared. It required a massive bailout from the US Treasury and IMF to prevent complete collapse. Some observers drew parallels to Asia. The vulnerabilities looked similar: foreign currency debt, current account deficits, overvalued currencies, asset bubbles. But the parallels were dismissed. Mexico was different. People said Mexican institutions were weaker. Mexican policies were less disciplined. The comparison doesn't apply to Asia. In Thailand, as 1996 turned to 1997, the pressure was building. Currency speculators, hedge funds and trading desks at major banks were beginning to test the baht. They would sell baht, betting it would weaken. The Bank of Thailand would defend it, buying baht with its dollar reserves. The speculators would back off temporarily. But the attacks were becoming more frequent, more aggressive. The Bank of Thailand's foreign reserves were being depleted. They tried to hide this, using forward contracts and other complex financial arrangements to make their reserve position look stronger than it was. But sophisticated market participants could see through the accounting. The reserves were running low. The ability to defend the peg was finite. Other Asian countries watched nervously. If Thailand was under pressure, could they be next? Their situations were similar: foreign debt, current account deficits, currency pegs. But they too believed their own situations were manageable, that Thailand's problems were specific to Thailand. In Seoul, the K-bols continued their aggressive expansion, confident in Korea's economic miracle. In Jakarta, the Suharto government maintained its pro-business policies, confident in its oil wealth and decades of growth. In Kuala Lumpur, Prime Minister Mahathir spoke confidently of Malaysia's Vision 2020. They planned to become a fully developed nation by 2020. The ordinary people of these countries, the factory workers, the office employees, the shopkeepers, the students, went about their lives largely unaware of the financial vulnerabilities building beneath the surface of prosperity. They saw the shopping malls and the new cars and the rising stock markets. They believed in the miracle because they were living it. A young Thai woman working in a Bangkok office might have just bought her first condominium, taking out a mortgage she could barely afford but confident that her salary would keep rising and property values would keep appreciating. A Korean family might have sent their son to study in America, paying in dollars but confident the won would remain stable. An Indonesian businessman might have expanded his factory with dollar loans, planning to pay them back with rupiah earnings from exports. These were rational decisions based on 3 decades of stability and growth. But they were decisions that assumed the future would resemble the past, that the patterns that had held for so long would continue to hold. By the spring of 1997, the stage was set. The vulnerabilities were in place: the foreign debt, the currency pegs, the asset bubbles, the slowing exports, the current account deficits. The confidence was still there, but it was increasingly fragile, based more on faith than fundamentals, and faith in financial markets can evaporate with stunning speed. Thailand stood on the edge. The Bank of Thailand was running out of reserves to defend the baht. The finance companies were in trouble. The real estate market was softening. Exports were weak. Foreign lenders were becoming nervous, starting to pull money out rather than roll over loans. All it would take was a trigger, a moment when the market collectively realized the emperor had no clothes, when the faith in the peg broke, when the tide of capital that had been flowing in for years suddenly reversed and flowed out. That moment was coming. In the summer of 1997, in the heat of the Thai dry season, the storm would break. And when it did, It would sweep across Asia with a speed and ferocity that would shock the world. But we're not there yet. Let the image rest for a moment. Asia in the spring of 1997, prosperous on the surface, vulnerable underneath, confident but fragile, standing at the edge of an abyss that almost no one could see. The attack on the Thai baht began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the early months of 1997. Currency speculation is an abstract concept, hard to visualize, but let me try to make it concrete. Imagine you believe that a currency is overvalued, or that a government's promise to maintain a fixed exchange rate can't be kept. You can profit from this belief by borrowing that currency, immediately selling it for dollars, waiting for it to weaken, then buying it back at the lower price to repay your loan. The difference is your profit. This is what hedge funds and trading desks at major banks began doing with the Thai baht in early 1997. They would borrow baht, sell them for dollars, creating downward pressure on the currency. The Bank of Thailand, committed to maintaining the peg at around 25 baht to the dollar, would have to buy baht with its dollar reserves to support the price. It became a test of wills. The speculators were betting that Thailand would run out of reserves before they ran out of money to bet with. The Bank of Thailand was betting it could outlast the speculators, that confidence would return, that the attack would fail. Through February, March, and April, the attacks came in waves. The Bank of Thailand fought back, spending billions of dollars from its reserves. They also raised interest rates sharply, making it more expensive to borrow baht, trying to discourage speculation. And they used forward contracts, essentially promises to sell dollars for baht at a future date, to make their reserve position appear stronger than it actually was. For a while, it seemed to work. The speculators would probe, the bank would defend. The speculators would retreat. The baht held at its peg, but each defense cost reserves, and sophisticated traders could estimate how much Thailand had left to spend. By May, the pressure was intensifying. George Soros, whose quantum fund had famously broken the Bank of England's defence of the pound in 1992, was reportedly among those betting against the baht. Other hedge funds joined. Banks' proprietary trading desks joined. The size of the bets against the baht was growing into the billions of dollars. The Bank of Thailand kept fighting. They spent reserves. They raised interest rates even higher, even though high rates were hurting the domestic economy. They made stern statements about defending the currency. They insisted the fundamentals were sound, that the speculators would lose, that Thailand's commitment to the peg was absolute. But behind the scenes, Thai officials were growing desperate. The usable foreign reserves were running low. The forward contracts they'd used had committed much of what remained. The finance companies were in serious trouble, and the government had quietly closed more of them. The real estate market was deteriorating. Capital was flowing out of the country. Something had to give. The government tried to arrange support. They talked to neighbouring countries about coordinated currency defence. They talked to Japan about financial assistance. They held emergency meetings debating options, looking for solutions that didn't exist. Because the fundamental problem was that Thailand had borrowed too much foreign currency, had a current account deficit that was unsustainable, had a real estate bubble that was deflating, and exports that were weak. Defending the currency peg wasn't solving these problems. It was just delaying the inevitable while depleting the resources needed to manage the crisis when it came. In late June, the situation became critical. The Bank of Thailand's reserves were nearly exhausted. The attacks were relentless. Interest rates were so high they were crushing businesses. The economy was sliding toward recession. The peg couldn't hold much longer. On July 2nd, 1997, the Bank of Thailand surrendered. That morning they announced that the baht would float, that they would no longer defend the fixed exchange rate. After years of promises, the peg was abandoned. The currency would now find its level in the market, determined by supply and demand rather than government intervention. The market's judgment was swift and brutal. The baht immediately plunged from around 25 per dollar to 29 per dollar, a 16% drop in a single day. Trading was chaotic. Currency dealers struggled to process the volume of transactions. Thai businesses and individuals watched in shock as their currency lost value by the hour. But this was just the beginning. Over the following weeks and months, the baht would continue to fall. By August, it was at 32 per dollar. By October, 40 per dollar. By January of 1998, it would bottom out near 56 per dollar, less than half its pre-crisis value. Think about what this meant for anyone with dollar-denominated debt, which was a substantial portion of Thailand's businesses and financial institutions. Imagine you're a Bangkok property developer. You borrowed $1 million to build a condominium project. At 25 baht per dollar, that's 25 million baht. Your revenue from selling the condos will be in baht, and you plan to earn enough baht to pay back the dollar loan. But now the baht has fallen to 50 per dollar. That $1 million debt is now 50 million baht. Your debt, measured in the currency you actually earn, has doubled. And this happened not because you made bad business decisions, not because your project failed, but because the currency moved. You're bankrupt through no fault of your own. Multiply this story by thousands. Property developers, manufacturing companies, banks, finance companies, all of them with dollar debts, all of them watching those debts double in real terms. Many had no way to pay. Bankruptcy became inevitable. The Thai finance company sector collapsed almost immediately. These institutions had borrowed dollars and lent baht for real estate projects. When the baht fell, their dollar debts ballooned while their baht assets remained fixed. They were insolvent. By the end of the year, 56 of Thailand's 58 finance companies would be closed, wiping out the savings of hundreds of thousands of depositors. The stock market went into freefall. The Stock Exchange of Thailand Index, which had been over 1,400 at the start of 1996, fell below 400 by late 1997, losing more than 70% of its value. Life savings invested in stocks evaporated. Pension funds and mutual funds that Thai workers had counted on for retirement became worth a fraction of their previous value. Construction sites across Bangkok fell silent. Those gleaming towers that had been rising month by month suddenly stopped. Cranes stood motionless. Workers were laid off en masse. Half-finished buildings stood empty. Monuments to overambition and borrowed money. Some would stand incomplete for years, rusting scaffolding still attached, windows never installed, ghost towers in the skyline. Let me tell you what this looked like at the human level, because the numbers and percentages don't capture the reality of lives upended. Consider a Bangkok banker, a man in his 30s who had worked his way up through the ranks, who had just been promoted to a management position. He had bought a condominium the year before, taking out a mortgage that stretched his finances, but seemed manageable given his rising salary and the confidence that property values would keep appreciating. The condo cost 4 million baht, about $160,000 at the old exchange rate. He put down some savings and borrowed the rest. His mortgage payment was 20,000 baht per month, about a third of his salary. Tight, but doable. Then July 2nd happened. The bank where he worked, heavily exposed to dollar debt and bad real estate loans, announced layoffs. He lost his job. The condo he'd bought for 4 million baht was now worth maybe 2 million in a collapsing market, less than he owed on the mortgage. His savings, invested in the stock market, had lost half their value. Within a month, this man went from rising professional with a promising future to unemployed, underwater on his mortgage, watching his savings disappear, scrambling to find any work to pay for food and keep a roof over his family's head. This wasn't one story. This was happening to hundreds of thousands of people across Bangkok, across Thailand. Or think about a street food vendor, an older woman who had saved diligently for years, keeping her savings in a finance company that offered higher interest rates than the big banks. She had about 200,000 baht saved, about $8,000 at the old rate. This was her security, her insurance against old age and illness, accumulated baht by baht from selling pad thai and somtam on a street corner. When her finance company collapsed, that money vanished. The government eventually offered some compensation, but only a fraction of what she'd lost. Years of careful saving, of denying herself small pleasures to build security, wiped out in an instant. Construction workers faced mass unemployment. The building boom that had employed hundreds of thousands of men suddenly stopped. Workers from rural provinces who'd come to Bangkok for jobs found themselves laid off, unable to send money back to their families in the countryside, returning home to villages that couldn't support them. University students saw their study abroad plans evaporate. The cost of studying in America or Australia, denominated in dollars, had suddenly doubled in baht terms. Families that had saved to send their children overseas found they could no longer afford it. Students already abroad, relying on remittances from home, had to cut their studies short and return. Middle-class families that had bought their first cars on credit found themselves unable to make the payments. Repossession became common. Parking lots filled with repossessed vehicles that dealers couldn't sell. The status symbol of car ownership, achieved after years of aspiration, was taken away. Luxury hotels in Bangkok and beach resorts saw occupancy plummet. Foreign tourists stayed away, nervous about stability. Business travel dried up as companies cut costs. Hotel workers were laid off. Tour guides lost their livelihoods. Restaurant owners in tourist areas watched their businesses fail. The psychological impact was profound. Thailand had been proud of its economic success, of its transformation from agricultural economy to modern industrial nation. That pride turned to shame and bewilderment. How had this happened? Why had the government let it happen? Who was to blame? There was anger directed at the speculators, at foreign hedge funds that had profited from Thailand's suffering. There was anger at the government for not preventing the crisis, for defending the peg too long, or not long enough, depending on whom you asked. There was anger at the banks and finance companies for reckless lending. There was anger everywhere, but anger didn't pay the bills or restore lost savings. And there was fear. If this could happen to Thailand's currency, to its financial system, to its economy, what else might collapse? Were the banks safe? Was any saving secure? Should you take your money out of the bank and hide it at home? But if everyone did that, the banks would fail, making everything worse. The crisis was also revealing inequalities and injustices that had been hidden by rising prosperity. The connected insiders, the wealthy elite with political ties, often managed to get their money out before the worst hit, to convert baht to dollars at favourable rates, to protect themselves. The ordinary people, who had trusted the system, who had saved and worked hard and played by the rules, were the ones who suffered most. Some businessmen, facing bankruptcy and disgrace, took their own lives. Suicide rates increased. Families broke apart under the strain. Domestic violence rose. The social fabric was fraying along with the economic fabric. And the crisis was just beginning in Thailand. Because the fall of the baht sent a signal to financial markets around the world. If Thailand could fall, despite its decades of growth and its apparent economic strength, then other Asian countries with similar vulnerabilities might fall too. Currency traders and investors began looking at Malaysia, at Indonesia, at the Philippines, at South Korea, reassessing risk, reconsidering exposure. The assumptions that had sustained capital flows into Asia, that these countries were safe, that their currencies were stable, that their growth was unstoppable, those assumptions were breaking down. Capital that had flowed into Asia for years began flowing out. Foreign investors sold their stocks, their bonds, their real estate holdings. They repatriated money, converting local currencies to dollars, creating selling pressure on every Asian currency. The contagion was beginning. Malaysia's ringgit came under attack within weeks of the baht's fall. The the Indonesian rupiah started weakening. The Philippine peso faced pressure. Stock markets across the region began falling as investors fled anything denominated in Asian currencies. What had started as Thailand's crisis was becoming Asia's crisis, and it was happening with stunning speed. The dominoes that had been carefully stacked over 3 decades of growth were beginning to fall one after another, and there seemed to be no way to stop them. In Bangkok, in those terrible days of early July and the weeks that followed, people tried to make sense of what was happening, tried to figure out how to survive, tried to maintain hope that this would be temporary, that recovery would come soon. But recovery wasn't coming soon. The crisis would deepen, would spread, would transform Asia in ways that no one in July of 1997 could fully imagine. Thailand's suffering was just the beginning of a regional catastrophe that would destroy wealth, end governments, and teach lessons that echoed for decades. Let that settle for a moment. Thailand in July 1997. The baht broken, the economy reeling, lives upended, fear spreading. The miracle revealed as fragile, built on foundations that couldn't bear the weight of doubt. The storm had broken, and it was only going to get worse. The fall of the Thai baht sent shockwaves through global financial markets, but the immediate and most devastating impact was felt across Southeast and East Asia. Because what investors suddenly realized in July of 1997 was that Thailand wasn't unique. The vulnerabilities that had brought down the baht existed throughout the region. Let's understand why the crisis spread so quickly, why what happened in Thailand couldn't be contained, why panic became epidemic. Financial contagion is a peculiar phenomenon. It's not entirely rational, but it's not entirely irrational either. When investors see one country with certain characteristics suffer a currency crisis, they immediately start reassessing other countries with similar characteristics. It's pattern recognition, risk management, self-protection. And the pattern was clear. Thailand had a currency pegged to the dollar, large amounts of foreign currency debt, a real estate bubble, a weakening export sector, and a significant current account deficit. When investors looked around Asia, they saw these same patterns repeated. Malaysia had them, Indonesia had them, the Philippines had them. Even South Korea, though it seemed different, shared many of the vulnerabilities. The psychological shift was sudden and dramatic. For years, money had flowed into Asia because it seemed like the safest bet in the emerging markets world. Asian economies had decades of strong growth, political stability, sound economic management. They were the good students, the success stories. Money had poured into stocks, bonds, real estate, bank deposits. But confidence in financial markets is fragile, built on collective belief that can evaporate almost instantaneously. Once doubt enters, once the first crack appears, the edifice can collapse with stunning speed. If Thailand can fall despite 3 decades of success, the thinking went, then nowhere in Asia is truly safe. Better to get your money out now before you're the last one holding devalued assets. This created a self-fulfilling dynamic. As investors pulled money out, they had to sell local currency assets and convert to dollars. This selling pressure weakened currencies and stock markets. The weakening currencies and falling markets confirmed investors' fears that they were right to pull out. So more pulled out, creating more pressure in a vicious cycle that fed on itself. The herd behavior was powerful. Fund managers didn't want to be the ones still holding Thai or Malaysian or Indonesian assets when they collapsed. Better to sell now and accept a small loss than wait and risk a large one. Even if you thought the selling was overdone, you had to go along with the herd or face the wrath of your investors. Malaysia felt the pressure almost immediately after Thailand's currency float. Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad had led Malaysia since 1981, overseeing impressive economic growth and modernization. Kuala Lumpur had transformed into a gleaming city of skyscrapers, including the Petronas Towers, which would briefly be the world's tallest buildings. Malaysia had attracted foreign investment, developed its electronics and palm oil sectors, built modern infrastructure. But Malaysia had vulnerabilities. The ringgit was pegged to the dollar. Malaysian banks and companies had borrowed in foreign currencies. The current account was in deficit. Real estate prices had risen sharply. When the baht fell, currency traders turned their attention to the ringgit. The Malaysian central bank tried to defend the currency, just as Thailand had. They spent reserves buying ringgit. They raised interest rates, but the pressure was relentless. In mid-July, just 2 weeks after Thailand's float, Malaysia had to let the ringgit weaken. It fell from about 2.5 ringgit per dollar to eventually over 4.7, losing nearly half its value. Mahathir was furious. He blamed currency speculators, particularly George Soros, accusing them of deliberately destabilizing Asian economies for profit. In a speech in late July, he called currency trading unnecessary, unproductive, and immoral. He suggested that trading currencies should be made illegal. There was an element of truth in his anger. Speculators were profiting from Asia's crisis, but they weren't creating the vulnerabilities, they were exploiting vulnerabilities that already existed. The foreign debt, the current account deficits, the asset bubbles, these were real problems that made currencies vulnerable regardless of speculation. The Malaysian stock market plummeted along with the currency. The Kuala Lumpur Composite Index fell from over 1,200 points in early 1997 to below 300 by late 98. Malaysian businesses with dollar debts faced the same nightmare as Thai companies, their debt burdens doubling in real terms. Construction projects halted. Workers were laid off. The prosperous confidence of the mid-90s gave way to fear and recession. Malaysians who had invested in stocks, who had borrowed to buy property, who had felt themselves rising into middle-class comfort, suddenly found their wealth disappearing. A Kuala Lumpur office worker who had invested his savings in the stock market watched 70% of it vanish. A young couple who had just bought a house with a mortgage found their debt far exceeding the property's value. University graduates found that jobs they'd been promised no longer existed. Mahathir's anger at speculators resonated with Malaysians looking for someone to blame. It was easier to believe that malicious outsiders had attacked Malaysia than to confront the uncomfortable truth that Malaysia's own policies and vulnerabilities had made it susceptible. Indonesia's descent was slower at first, but would ultimately be more catastrophic than Thailand's or Malaysia's. The Indonesian rupiah began weakening in August, a month after Thailand's crisis began. The Bank of Indonesia initially tried to defend the currency by spending reserves and raising interest rates. But Indonesia's vulnerabilities were profound, perhaps deeper than its neighbours. The Suharto government had ruled for over 30 years. While this had provided political stability that supported economic growth, it had also created a system of crony capitalism where Suharto's family and associates received favourable treatment in business deals, contracts, and access to credit. Banks lent to connected borrowers regardless of creditworthiness. Regulations were bent or ignored for those with political ties. The Indonesian banking system was particularly weak. Many banks were essentially insolvent, kept alive by connected lending and regulatory forbearance. Indonesian companies had accumulated enormous foreign currency debts. Estimates suggested over $80 billion by mid-1997. Indonesia was also more dependent on imports than its neighbours. It imported food, medicine, industrial inputs, fuel. When the rupiah weakened, the cost of these imports rose, creating inflation and hardship for ordinary Indonesians who lived on tight budgets. In August, the Bank of Indonesia abandoned the rupiah's peg and let it float. The currency fell from about 2,400 per dollar to over 3,000. But this was just the beginning. Unlike Thailand or Malaysia, where currencies fell rapidly then stabilized at new lower levels, the rupiah would continue falling for months, accelerating into what became the worst currency collapse of the entire crisis. By September, the rupiah was trading at 4,000 per dollar. By October, 6,000. By December, approaching 10,000, and it would eventually spike to over 16,000 in January of 1998, losing more than 85% of its value. 85%. Think about what that means for an economy, for people's savings and debts and daily lives. Indonesia would seek help from the International Monetary Fund, and we'll explore that more deeply later. But even with IMF assistance, the crisis would deepen, becoming not just economic but political and social, threatening the very fabric of Indonesian society. The Philippines was hit in July as well, though it would weather the crisis somewhat better than its neighbours. The Philippine peso, which had been relatively stable at around 26 per dollar, came under pressure immediately after Thailand's baht collapsed. The Philippine Central Bank let the peso float on July 11th, and it quickly depreciated to over 40 per dollar by early 1998. The Philippine stock market fell sharply. Banks and companies with dollar debt struggled. Overseas Filipino workers, who sent billions in remittances home annually, found that their dollar earnings bought more pesos, a small silver lining in the crisis, helping to cushion some families. But the Philippines had some advantages. It had less foreign debt than Thailand, Indonesia or Korea. Its banks were somewhat more conservatively managed. The economy was less overheated, partly because it had never experienced quite the same boom as its neighbours. So while the Philippines suffered, it didn't experience the catastrophic collapse that Indonesia and Thailand did. Still, for ordinary Filipinos, the crisis was painful. Jobs were lost, savings diminished. The economic progress of the mid-90s was reversed. Families that had been climbing out of poverty slipped back. The crisis was a setback, years of gains erased in months. Hong Kong presented a unique case, a fascinating battle that played out in October of 1997. Hong Kong's currency, the Hong Kong dollar, wasn't simply pegged to the US dollar. It operated under a currency board system that had been in place since 1983. Under this system, every Hong Kong dollar in circulation had to be backed by US dollar reserves. The commitment to the peg was absolute, built into the fundamental structure of the monetary system. In October, after the crises in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia and the Philippines, speculators turned their attention to Hong Kong. They bet that Hong Kong would be forced to break its peg, just as the others had. The attack was massive, coordinated, sophisticated. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority fought back using a brilliant but painful strategy. To defend the currency peg, they allowed interest rates to spike to extraordinarily high levels. Overnight interest rates briefly hit 300%. Yes, 300%. The logic was to make it prohibitively expensive to borrow Hong Kong dollars to speculate against the currency. But high interest rates devastated the stock market. The Hang Seng Index, Hong Kong's main stock index, plummeted. It fell from over 16,000 points in August to below 9,000 in October, a decline of over 40% in just weeks. Property values, a crucial component of Hong Kong's wealth, also fell sharply. Hong Kong residents watched their savings and property values collapse. The pain was real, immediate, frightening. But the government held firm, refusing to break the peg despite the economic cost, and it worked. The speculators, facing enormous costs to maintain their positions and seeing Hong Kong's determination, eventually gave up. The peg held. By late October, the pressure eased. Interest rates came back down. The worst was over for Hong Kong. But the victory came at a price. The high interest rates and falling asset prices pushed Hong Kong into recession. Unemployment rose. Businesses failed. The psychological trauma of watching wealth evaporate was real. Still, Hong Kong's ability to maintain its peg was a rare bright spot in a region of currency collapses. By late October, early November of 1997, the crisis was no longer just an Asian story. It was becoming a global concern. The US stock market, which had been soaring through 1997, experienced a sharp correction. On October 27th, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 554 points. a 7.2% decline, the largest point drop in history at that time. The immediate trigger was fear about the Asian crisis spreading and affecting the global economy. Trading was so volatile that the New York Stock Exchange implemented circuit breakers, temporarily halting trading to let panic subside. The sense that Asia's problems could threaten the entire global financial system was real and frightening. Latin American markets, which had been strong, began to weaken. Brazil, Argentina, Mexico all saw capital outflows as investors became more risk-averse, pulling money out of all emerging markets, not just Asian ones. The crisis was demonstrating how interconnected global financial markets had become. Russia's markets were affected too. The Russian stock market fell sharply in the fall of 1997. This was a warning sign of vulnerabilities in Russia that would explode into crisis in 1998, though that's beyond our current story. The global repercussions forced international institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the US Treasury, central banks, to take the crisis seriously. What had started as Thailand's problem in July was by November a potential threat to global financial stability. Emergency meetings were held, rescue packages were assembled, the machinery of international crisis management was activated. For the people living through this across Asia, the speed was disorienting. In the space of 4 months, from July to November, entire economies had collapsed. Currencies that had been stable for years lost half or more of their value. Stock markets were decimated. Banks were failing. Unemployment was rising. The prosperity of the mid-90s seemed like a distant dream. A businessman in Jakarta, looking at his company's balance sheet in November, saw dollar debts that had quadrupled in rupiah terms, saw exports falling because global demand for Indonesian products was weakening, saw no clear path to survival. Should he try to restructure the debt? File for bankruptcy? Just walk away? A factory worker in Bangkok who had been laid off in August was still looking for work in November, watching his savings dwindle. Trying to decide whether to return to his rural village or keep trying in the city where opportunities were vanishing. A young professional in Kuala Lumpur who had invested her savings in mutual funds watched the value fall month after month, wondering if it would ever recover, whether she should sell now and preserve something or hold on and hope. And everyone was asking the same questions. How did this happen so fast? Why couldn't anyone stop it? When would it end? How much worse could it get? The answers to those last 2 questions were sobering. It wasn't going to end soon, and it was going to get worse, particularly for Korea and Indonesia. Because by November, while Thailand, Malaysia and the Philippines were already deep in crisis, the largest dominoes hadn't fallen yet. South Korea, the 11th largest economy in the world, was teetering on the edge. And Indonesia's crisis was about to transition from economic to political, threatening the entire social order. The contagion had spread with terrifying speed. The assumptions that had underpinned decades of Asian growth were revealed as illusions. The miracle was over. The question now was how deep the disaster would go, how long recovery would take, and what would be left when the storm finally passed. Let that rest for a moment. Asia in late 1997, engulfed in crisis, watching the dominoes fall one after another, wondering where it would end, hoping desperately that the worst was over but fearing it wasn't. South Korea seemed different. That's what everyone believed through the summer and fall of 1997 as the crisis spread through Southeast Asia. Korea was richer, more developed, more sophisticated. It had joined the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 1996, the club of wealthy industrialized nations. It was the 11th largest economy in the world. It made cars that competed with Japanese and American brands, electronics that were sold globally, ships that sailed every ocean. The Korean miracle had been even more dramatic than Thailand's or Malaysia's. In 1960, South Korea's per capita income was comparable to many African nations. The country had been devastated by the Korean War, divided from the north, dependent on American aid for survival. But through export-led industrialization, through building the cable conglomerates, through massive investment in education and infrastructure, Korea had transformed itself into an economic powerhouse. So when Thailand's crisis began in July, when Malaysia and Indonesia followed, Koreans watched with a mixture of sympathy and confidence. Those countries had problems Korea didn't have, they thought. Korea's institutions were stronger, its economy more diversified, its companies more competitive. The crisis wouldn't spread here. But underneath Korea's gleaming surface, vulnerabilities were hidden, perhaps more dangerous than Thailand's or Malaysia's, because they were wrapped in the appearance of strength. Let's talk about the chaebol, because understanding them is essential to understanding Korea's crisis. Chaebol is a Korean word for family-owned business conglomerates. Samsung, Hyundai, Daewoo, LG, SK, these are the famous names, but there were dozens of others. These conglomerates were massive, sprawling empires that dominated the Korean economy. Samsung alone accounted for roughly 20% of Korea's entire GDP. They were vertically integrated, controlling everything from raw materials to manufacturing to retail to finance. The chaebol had been the engine of Korea's growth. The government had deliberately nurtured them, providing cheap credit, protecting them from competition, encouraging them to enter new industries and export markets. The strategy worked brilliantly for decades. The chaebol made Korea a global player in automobiles, electronics, shipbuilding, chemicals, construction. But by the 1990s, the chaebol system had deep problems. The conglomerates were massively over-leveraged. They had borrowed aggressively to expand, often into industries where they had no expertise. Debt-to-equity ratios at many chaebol exceeded 400%, meaning they owed $4 for every dollar of actual equity. In a normal market economy, companies with such high debt levels would have been forced to restructure or would have gone bankrupt. But in Korea, they kept getting more loans. Why did banks keep lending to unprofitable, over-indebted companies? Because of the implicit government guarantee. The chaebol were considered too big to fail. They employed millions of workers, generated huge exports, were sources of national pride. The government wouldn't let them collapse. So banks lent to them regardless of profitability, knowing the government would bail everyone out if necessary. This is what economists call moral hazard, when the expectation of bailout encourages risky behaviour. The chaebol also had low profitability despite huge revenues. They operated on tiny profit margins, sometimes losing money even as they expanded. The logic was to gain market share, to become indispensable, to grow too big to fail. Profit could come later, but later never quite arrived. And crucially, many chaebol had borrowed in foreign currencies, particularly dollars. Korean interest rates were higher than American rates, so borrowing dollars seemed cheaper. And the won was stable against the dollar. It had been for years. So why not borrow the cheaper dollars? By 1997, Korean banks and companies had accumulated well over $100 billion in foreign debt. Much of this was short-term debt, needing to be rolled over every few months or annually. As long as foreign lenders kept providing new loans when old ones came due, the system worked. But the system depended on confidence. And in the fall of 1997, as the Southeast Asian crisis deepened, confidence in Korea was beginning to crack. Foreign lenders started looking more carefully at Korean balance sheets. What they saw worried them. The high debt levels, the low profitability, the weakening export sector, the exposure to the broader Asian crisis. When loans came due, instead of rolling them over, foreign banks started demanding repayment. Korean banks, which had borrowed short-term in dollars to lend long-term in won, suddenly faced a liquidity crisis. They needed dollars to repay their foreign creditors, but their assets were in won and couldn't be quickly converted. They turned to the Bank of Korea, the central bank, which had foreign currency reserves. But the reserves, while substantial, weren't unlimited. Through October and November, the situation deteriorated. Foreign banks were pulling credit lines. Korean banks were scrambling for dollars. The Bank of Korea was spending reserves to provide dollars to banks, trying to prevent a full-blown crisis. The won started weakening. It had been stable at around 800 won per dollar for years. In October it began to slip, 850, 900, 950. The Bank of Korea tried to defend it, spending reserves, raising interest rates, but the pressure was relentless. Korean companies with dollar debts watched nervously. Every won that the currency weakened meant their debt burdens increased. A company that owed $100 million saw that debt rise from 80 billion won at the old rate to 90 billion, then 95 billion, then 100 billion won as the currency weakened. In late October, one of Korea's largest chaebol, Hanbo Steel, declared bankruptcy. Then in November, Kia Motors, another major chaebol, collapsed. These failures shocked Korea. Chaebol weren't supposed to fail. They were institutions, national champions, too important to be allowed to collapse. But they were collapsing, and their failures threatened the banks that had lent to them. If the banks couldn't recover their loans to failed chaebol, the banks themselves would become insolvent. By mid-November, the situation was critical. Korea's usable foreign reserves were running dangerously low. The government had committed much of what remained through forward contracts and other obligations. The won was in freefall. The stock market was plunging. The banking system was on the verge of collapse. On November 21, 1997, Korea made the devastating decision to seek help from the International Monetary Fund. For Korea, this was a moment of profound national humiliation. The IMF was associated with failed economies, with countries that couldn't manage their own affairs, with the kind of crisis that happened to poorly managed developing nations, not to Korea, not to the 11th largest economy in the world, not to an OECD member. But there was no choice. Korea needed foreign currency to prevent default on its sovereign debt, to prevent complete collapse of the banking system. Only the IMF had the resources to provide a bailout large enough to make a difference. The won continued falling. By late November, it was approaching 1,500 per dollar, nearly double its pre-crisis level. The stock market had lost more than half its value. Every day brought more bad news, another company defaulting, another bank in trouble, more layoffs announced. On December 3, 1997, Korea signed an agreement with the IMF for the largest bailout package in the institution's history, $57 billion. The World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and individual countries including the United States and Japan contributed to the package. It was an enormous sum, recognition of both Korea's importance and the severity of its crisis, but the money came with conditions, strict conditions. Korea would have to restructure its chaebol, reform its banking sector, open its economy to more foreign investment, maintain high interest rates, reduce government spending. The IMF was essentially requiring Korea to abandon much of the economic model that had produced the miracle. The conditions sparked fierce debate in Korea. Some argued they were necessary, that Korea's model had become unsustainable, that reform was overdue. Others saw the IMF conditions as foreign interference, as forcing Western-style capitalism on Korea, as unnecessary punishment for a crisis that hadn't been entirely Korea's fault. But debate was a luxury Korea couldn't afford. Accept the conditions or face default and complete economic collapse. The government accepted. December of 1997 was the darkest time in modern Korean history outside of war. The won continued falling, eventually reaching over 1,700 per dollar in late December. The stock market kept dropping. Unemployment, which had been around 2% in early 97, was rising rapidly towards 7%. Then higher. Companies were announcing layoffs by the thousands. The concept of lifetime employment, which had been central to Korean corporate culture, ended almost overnight. Older workers who had dedicated their careers to companies, expecting security until retirement, found themselves let go. The social contract was breaking. Bankruptcy and unemployment carried profound shame in Korean culture. Business owners who failed took it as personal dishonor. Some couldn't face it. Suicide rates increased, particularly among middle-aged men who had lost businesses or jobs. Families that had been solidly middle class fell into poverty. A Seoul office worker who lost his job might try to hide it from his family at first, leaving for work each day and spending the day looking for jobs or just sitting in parks, returning home at the usual time. But bills still needed to be paid, and eventually the truth came out. University graduates who had expected to join prestigious chaebol or government ministries found no jobs available. Years of study, their family's investment in education seemed wasted. The path to success that had seemed clear just months before had vanished. Consumer spending collapsed. Department stores that had been crowded with shoppers stood nearly empty. Luxury car dealerships closed. Restaurants went out of business. The consumer boom of the mid-90s reversed almost instantly. But amid the darkness, something remarkable happened that revealed both Korean national character and the depth of the crisis's psychological impact. In early January of 1998, as the crisis was deepening, a grassroots movement began called the Gold Collection Campaign. Ordinary Koreans began donating gold, jewellery, family heirlooms, gold bars, anything made of gold, to help repay the national debt. Housewives brought wedding rings. The elderly brought gold spoons and chopsticks that had been family treasures for generations. Students brought small gold items they'd received as gifts. People lined up at collection centres to donate, to do something, anything, to help their country in crisis. In Seoul, in Busan, in cities and towns across Korea, the collections took place. Television broadcast footage of people donating, of piles of gold accumulating. The campaign collected over 200 tons of gold, valued at roughly $2 billion, not nearly enough to solve the crisis. But symbolically powerful. The gold campaign revealed multiple layers of emotion. There was patriotism, the desire to help the nation in crisis. There was also a kind of collective penance, an acknowledgement that everyone, not just the chaebol or the government or the banks, had participated in the excesses that led to crisis. And there was pride mixed with shame, pride in Korean resilience and solidarity. Shame that such measures were necessary. Presidential elections were scheduled for December 18th, in the middle of the crisis. The campaign became a referendum on how to handle the catastrophe. Kim Dae-jung, a long-time opposition leader who had been persecuted and nearly killed by previous governments, ran on a platform of reform and recovery. He won, becoming president-elect just as the crisis was at its worst. Kim would take office in February of 1998, inheriting an economy in ruins, but his election represented hope that change was possible, that Korea could reform and recover. Still, in late December of 1997, recovery seemed distant. The immediate reality was pain and uncertainty. Korean families gathered for New Year celebrations in late December, knowing that 1998 would be a year of hardship. The optimism and prosperity of the mid-90s seemed like it belonged to another era. Parents worried about how to tell children there would be less money, fewer opportunities. Young couples postponed marriage plans. Elderly parents worried about being burdens on children who could barely support themselves. The transformation had been so rapid it was hard to process. In January of 1997, Korea had seemed invulnerable, on the verge of joining the ranks of truly wealthy nations. By January of 1998, the country was in the deepest crisis in its modern, peacetime history, dependent on IMF support. Watching unemployment soar, facing an uncertain future, the psychological impact was profound and would last for decades. Koreans who lived through 1997 and 98 would forever after be more cautious, more aware of vulnerability, less confident that prosperity was permanent. The crisis became seared into collective memory as quote 5, the moment when the miracle almost died. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In late December of 1997, as Korea grappled with its catastrophe, the regional crisis was still spreading, still deepening. Indonesia's crisis was evolving from economic to political and social. Other countries were struggling. The full extent of the damage wasn't yet clear, and the debates about what had caused the crisis, how to respond to it, what lessons to learn, those debates were just beginning. The IMF rescue packages were controversial, their conditions disputed. Whether the crisis represented a failure of Asian capitalism or of global financial system remained contested. Let the weight of Korea's crisis settle for a moment. A proud nation brought low, a miracle interrupted, millions of lives upended by forces that seemed beyond anyone's control. The suffering was real, immediate, frightening. But so was the resilience, the determination to survive and eventually recover. Both were true. Both mattered. While Korea's crisis shocked the world because of Korea's size and sophistication, Indonesia's crisis became something different, something more than economic catastrophe. Indonesia's crisis became a revolution, a complete transformation of society and politics, revealing how an economic collapse can unravel the entire fabric of a nation. Indonesia in 1997 was the fourth most populous country in the world, with over 200 million people spread across thousands of islands. It was also among the poorest of the crisis-affected countries, with per capita income around $1,000, much lower than Korea's $10,000 or Thailand's $3,000. This meant that most Indonesians lived closer to the edge, with less cushion to absorb economic shock. For over 30 years since 1967, Indonesia had been ruled by President Suharto and his New Order government. The name itself, New Order, was meant to distinguish Suharto's rule from the chaos and violence of the 1960s. And for 3 decades, Suharto delivered stability and economic growth. Indonesia's economy grew steadily through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Poverty rates fell, infrastructure improved. Jakarta transformed from a modest colonial-era city into a sprawling modern metropolis. But Suharto's New Order was built on a foundation of crony capitalism, more blatant than anything in Thailand or Korea. Suharto's family and close associates controlled vast business empires. They received preferential treatment in government contracts, favourable loans from state banks, monopolies in certain industries. If you wanted to do business in Indonesia, you needed connections to the Suharto family or the military elite. This corruption was understood, accepted as the price of stability. The banking system reflected this cronyism. Banks lent to those with political connections regardless of the soundness of their business plans. Risk assessment was secondary to political considerations. By 1997, Indonesian banks were carrying enormous amounts of bad loans that would never be repaid. But as long as confidence held, as long as the economy kept growing, the rot remained hidden. Indonesia also had a significant ethnic Chinese minority, perhaps 3 or 4% of the population, who controlled a disproportionate share of business and wealth. This created tensions. Ethnic Chinese Indonesians were often resented by the indigenous Pribumi majority. During times of stress, this resentment could turn violent. When the Thai baht collapsed in July, Indonesia seemed initially less vulnerable than Thailand. Indonesia had oil and natural gas, commodities that provided export earnings. The government was running budget surpluses, inflation was under control. There were problems, yes, but they seemed manageable. But as the crisis spread through Southeast Asia, investors began reassessing Indonesia. The rupiah, which had been stable at around 2,400 per dollar, began weakening in August. The Bank of Indonesia initially tried to defend it, spending reserves, raising interest rates. But the pressure intensified. On August 14, 1997, Indonesia abandoned the rupiah's peg and let it float. The currency immediately depreciated, falling to around 2,700 per dollar. This seemed manageable, a roughly 12% decline, but it was just the beginning. The rupiah would continue falling week after week, month after month, in what became the worst currency collapse of the entire Asian crisis. Let's follow the rupiah's descent, because the numbers are almost incomprehensible in their scale. By September, 3,000 per dollar. By October, 4,000. By November, as Korea's crisis was intensifying, the rupiah was at 6,000 per dollar. It had lost more than half its value in just 3 months. Indonesian companies with dollar debts were facing catastrophe. By December, the rupiah was approaching 10,000 per dollar. And in January of 1998, it would spike to over 16,000 per dollar, a collapse of more than 85% from its pre-crisis value. Think about what this means in concrete terms. A loaf of bread that cost 1,000 rupiah in July would cost 7,000 rupiah by January, if you could even find it. Medicine imported from abroad would cost 7 times as much. Fuel, much of which Indonesia had to import despite being an oil producer, became prohibitively expensive. For ordinary Indonesians living on fixed incomes or facing unemployment, this was devastating. Indonesia was heavily dependent on imports, not just for manufactured goods, but for basic necessities. Food, particularly rice, was partially imported. Medicine was largely imported. Industrial inputs for manufacturing were imported. When the rupiah collapsed, the cost of all these imports soared. Rice prices quintupled within months. For a country where rice is the staple food, where the poor spend the majority of their income on food, this was catastrophic. Families that had been getting by on tight budgets suddenly couldn't afford enough to eat. Malnutrition increased, particularly among children and the elderly. Medicine shortages developed. Hospitals ran low on essential drugs because the rupiah cost of imported pharmaceuticals became unaffordable. People with chronic conditions, diabetes, heart disease, asthma, found themselves unable to access medication. Some died from treatable conditions because they couldn't afford treatment. The Indonesian middle class, which had been growing through the 90s, was decimated. Consider a Jakarta school teacher earning 2 million rupiah per month, about $800 at the old exchange rate, a modest but livable middle-class income. By January of 1998, that same 2 million rupiah was worth only about $125. The teacher's salary in real purchasing power had fallen by more than 80%. Families that had achieved middle-class status through years of work, that had bought modest homes, could afford to send children to good schools, could occasionally eat at restaurants or buy consumer goods, fell back into poverty almost overnight. Years of upward mobility reversed in months. The stock market collapse was equally severe. The Jakarta Stock Exchange Composite Index fell from over 700 points in mid-97 to below 300 by late 98. Indonesians who had invested savings in stocks watched them become nearly worthless. In October of 1997, as the crisis deepened, Indonesia turned to the International Monetary Fund for help. An initial agreement was reached for a rescue package of around $40 billion, later expanded. But the conditions attached to the IMF program would prove controversial and ultimately destabilizing. The IMF required Indonesia to close 16 insolvent banks. This made economic sense. These banks were badly run, heavily exposed to bad loans, draining resources. But one of the banks belonged to Suharto's son. Closing it was a direct challenge to Suharto's authority and family interests. When the banks were closed in November, it triggered panic. Depositors at other banks, fearing their banks might be next, rushed to withdraw money. Bank runs spread across Jakarta and beyond. People lined up for hours, sometimes days, trying to get their savings out. Some banks ran out of cash. The banking system, already fragile, was being pushed towards complete collapse. Suharto's response to the IMF program was telling. He signed the agreement in October. There's a famous photograph of him sitting with the IMF's managing director, Michel Camdesus, standing over him with arms folded, an image that many Indonesians found humiliating, their president appearing to take orders from a foreigner. But having signed the agreement, Suharto largely ignored it. He was unwilling or unable to implement the reforms the IMF demanded. Banks that should have been closed remained open. Monopolies that should have been broken up remained intact. Budget commitments weren't met. Suharto was protecting his family's interests and his political allies, even as his country's economy collapsed. The IMF responded by demanding a second, stricter agreement in January of 1998. This one required detailed budget commitments, including cutting subsidies for fuel and basic commodities that had kept prices affordable for ordinary Indonesians. The IMF's logic was that subsidies were fiscally unsustainable and distorted markets. But the timing couldn't have been worse. There's another famous photograph from January, Suharto displaying Indonesia's budget for the cameras, with line items showing exactly how government spending would be cut. The image was meant to show Indonesia's commitment to reform. Instead, it was seen as another humiliation. The nation's financial plans put on public display like a bankrupt company's books. Cutting fuel subsidies meant prices at the pump increased dramatically. For a poor family using kerosene for cooking, the cost of basic survival rose sharply. For businesses using fuel for transportation or manufacturing, costs soared. The social impact was immediate and severe. Food prices continued rising through late 97 and early 98, driven both by the rupiah's collapse and by drought affecting crops. People in Jakarta and other cities began stockpiling rice and other staples, fearing shortages. Some stores imposed rationing. Long lines formed wherever affordable food could be found. Unemployment was rising rapidly. Manufacturing companies, unable to afford imported inputs or to service dollar debts, laid off workers. Construction projects halted. Export industries struggled because even though the weak rupiah made Indonesian goods cheaper abroad, companies couldn't get financing or materials. Urban workers who lost jobs returned to rural villages, overwhelming families and communities that couldn't support them. By the spring of 1998, Indonesia wasn't just experiencing economic crisis. The entire social and political order was beginning to crack. University students, historically important in Indonesian politics, began organizing protests. They demanded reform, an end to corruption, Suharto's resignation. The protests started small, dozens or hundreds of students on campuses. But as the economic crisis deepened, as ordinary Indonesians' suffering intensified, the protests grew larger and more vocal. In May of 1998, the situation exploded into violence and chaos. The trigger was Suharto's announcement of fuel price increases in early May, the final implementation of IMF-required subsidy cuts. Fuel prices nearly tripled. This was the breaking point. Students occupied campuses. Protests spread beyond universities into the streets. Workers joined. The urban poor joined. On May 12th, security forces shot and killed 6 student protesters at Trisakti University in Jakarta. The killings shocked the nation and inflamed the protests. Students' bodies were returned to campus. Thousands gathered for funerals and vigils. The violence that followed was among the worst Indonesia had seen in decades. Riots broke out in Jakarta and other cities. The rage was directed partly at the government, but also, terribly, at the ethnic Chinese minority. Mobs attacked Chinese-owned shops and homes. Buildings were looted and burned. There were reports of rapes and murders targeting Chinese Indonesians. The death toll from the May riots would eventually be estimated at over 1,000. The violence revealed the depth of social tensions that prosperity had masked but never resolved. The resentment of the Chinese minority, who were seen as wealthy and privileged, while ordinary pribumi Indonesians suffered, erupted into horrific violence. Many Chinese Indonesian families fled the country, taking whatever wealth they could salvage, seeking safety in Singapore, Australia, the United States. Jakarta in mid-May was a city in chaos. Smoke rose from burning buildings. Streets were filled with protesters. Stores were shuttered and barricaded. Middle-class families stayed home, afraid to venture out. The military was deployed but seemed uncertain whether to support the protesters or Suharto. Suharto, who had ruled for over 3 decades with absolute authority, who had survived previous challenges through a combination of repression and co-optation, found his power evaporating. Key ministers resigned. His political party's support collapsed. The military, while not openly turning against him, made clear they wouldn't use full force to keep him in power. On May 21st, 1998, after 32 years of rule, Suharto resigned. He appeared on television, reading a brief statement, transferring power to his vice president, B.J. Habibie. He looked old, diminished, the aura of invincibility gone. The man who had shaped Indonesia for a generation was leaving power not in triumph, but in defeat, driven out by economic collapse and popular uprising. Indonesia erupted in celebration. Students cheered, people danced in the streets. Suharto's fall, which had seemed impossible just months earlier, had happened. The new order was over. What would come next was uncertain, but the old regime had fallen. Yet the euphoria was mixed with anxiety. Habibie, the new president, was a Suharto protégé, not a reformer. Would he truly change things, or just continue the old system under a new name? The economy was still in ruins. The rupiah was still worthless. Banks were still failing. Unemployment was still rising. Violence had shown how fragile social order was. Ethnic and religious tensions that had been suppressed were now visible and volatile. Indonesia, in late May of 1998, was a country transformed but traumatized. The economic crisis had triggered political revolution. But the revolution hadn't solved the economic crisis. The challenges ahead were enormous. Rebuilding a shattered economy, creating legitimate democratic institutions, addressing corruption, healing social divisions, restoring confidence. For ordinary Indonesians, the immediate concerns were more basic: finding work, feeding families, accessing medicine, staying safe. A Jakarta mother with children to feed didn't care about the political implications of regime change. She cared about the price of rice, about whether her husband could find work, about whether it was safe to send her children to school. An ethnic Chinese shopkeeper surveying his looted store wondered whether to try to rebuild or to leave Indonesia. The country his family had lived in for generations, but where he no longer felt safe. A university student who had protested for reform now wondered what reform would actually look like, whether the new government would be better than the old. Indonesia's crisis revealed how economic collapse could cascade into political and social catastrophe. The vulnerabilities in the financial system, the foreign debt, the weak banks, the currency peg, had triggered currency collapse. The currency collapse had created economic hardship. The hardship had exposed and intensified social tensions. The tensions had exploded into violence, and the violence had brought down a government. It showed that economic crisis is never just about economics. It's about trust in institutions, about social cohesion, about political legitimacy. When the economy fails severely enough, everything else becomes unstable too. The suffering in Indonesia was profound. Millions pushed into poverty, families broken by unemployment and inflation, communities torn by violence, an entire nation's faith in its future shattered. The psychological scars would last for decades. But there was also resilience. People found ways to survive. Communities came together to help each other. The determination to rebuild, to create something better from the ruins, was real. The fall of Suharto opened possibilities for democratic reform that hadn't existed before. The crisis, terrible as it was, created an opportunity for change. As we move forward from Indonesia's trauma, remember that we're following not just economic statistics, but human beings navigating catastrophe, trying to protect their families, maintain dignity, find hope in desperate circumstances. Their suffering was real, but so was their strength. Both deserve to be honoured and remembered. Let that settle. Indonesia in May of 1998, Suharto fallen, the economy ruined, society fractured, but also people enduring, persisting, hoping that the worst had passed and better days might eventually come. We've talked about currencies and stock markets, about banks and governments, about policies and bailouts. But let's step away from the abstractions now and sit with the human reality of what the 1997 crisis meant for the millions of ordinary people who lived through it. Because economic statistics, however dramatic, can't capture what it felt like to watch your life collapse, to lose security you'd worked years to build, to face choices no one should have to make. The middle class, that group that had emerged so proudly through the 1980s and 90s, fell furthest and fastest. These were families who had climbed out of poverty through education and hard work, who had believed they'd secured their futures, who had just begun to enjoy modest comfort. Consider a Thai accountant in his 40s living in Bangkok. He had a university degree, worked for a respectable company, earned a decent salary. In 1996, he and his wife had bought a small condominium, their first owned home after years of renting. They took out a mortgage, stretched their finances, but it felt manageable and worthwhile. They furnished it carefully, bought a used car, sent their daughter to a good private school. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable, stable, optimistic about the future. Then July of 1997 came. His company, heavily exposed to the real estate sector, began laying off staff. He survived the first round of cuts, then the second. But the third round in September took his job, at 43 with a mortgage and a child to support. He was unemployed for the first time in his adult life. The job market had collapsed. Positions that might have existed before were gone. He sent out dozens of applications and heard nothing back. The savings he and his wife had accumulated, enough for maybe 3 months of expenses, began to dwindle. The condo, which they'd bought for 3 million baht, was now worth perhaps 1.5 million, less than they owed on the mortgage. They were underwater, trapped. His wife, who had worked part-time, tried to find full-time work, but opportunities were scarce. They pulled their daughter from private school and enrolled her in public school, a step down that felt like failure. They sold the car. They couldn't afford the payments anyway. They cut every possible expense. No more meals at restaurants, no new clothes, no small luxuries that had marked their middle-class status. By early 1998, they were behind on the mortgage. The bank sent notices threatening foreclosure. They moved in with his wife's parents. 3 generations crowded into a small house, the condo abandoned to the bank. The furniture they'd bought, the small possessions that represented their climb to middle-class life, mostly left behind. This man's story was repeated hundreds of thousands of times across Thailand, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia. The specifics varied, but the pattern was the same. Families who had achieved modest prosperity watching it disappear, falling back into poverty or near poverty, their dreams interrupted, their faith in the future shaken. The psychological toll was immense. For men in particular, in cultures where masculine identity was closely tied to being the family provider, unemployment carried crushing shame. A Korean office worker who lost his job might leave home each morning as if going to work, spending the day in parks or libraries, returning at the usual time, hiding his unemployment from his family out of shame. When the truth eventually came out, the humiliation was profound. Marriages strained under the pressure. Arguments about money became constant. Some marriages broke. Divorce rates increased, though many couples stayed together not from love but from lack of alternatives. Neither could afford to live separately. Domestic violence increased as stress and desperation mounted. Children absorbed their parents' anxiety. They learned not to ask for things, learned to be quiet about hunger, learned that the security they'd taken for granted was an illusion. A Jakarta child who had been taking music lessons, a small middle-class luxury, suddenly stopped. The family couldn't afford it. She didn't ask why. She understood. Beyond the middle class falling, there were the newly poor, people who had been working class, barely getting by even in good times, who were pushed into destitution by the crisis. Factory workers across the region faced mass layoffs. Export industries contracted as global demand weakened and companies couldn't get financing. Manufacturing plants that had employed thousands laid off half their workforce, then closed entirely. A Thai textile worker who had spent 15 years at the same factory, who had counted on that job for security, found herself unemployed with skills that were suddenly worthless. Construction workers, who had been abundant during the building boom, found work vanishing overnight. Projects halted mid-construction. Contractors went bankrupt. A Malaysian construction worker who'd been earning steady wages, enough to support his family in a kampung village, suddenly had nothing. No severance pay, no unemployment insurance, just a sudden end to income. Service workers, waiters, hotel staff, taxi drivers, shop clerks saw demand disappear. Restaurants closed as people stopped eating out. Hotels stood empty as tourism declined. Retail sales collapsed. A sole taxi driver who had taken out a loan to buy his taxi found himself with few passengers but the same loan payments. He drove longer hours for less money, barely covering fuel costs, falling further behind on the loan. Domestic workers were let go by middle-class families who could no longer afford help. A Filipino maid working in Manila, sending money home to her province to support her children, lost her position when the family she worked for faced their own financial crisis. She returned to her province, to poverty, her dreams of giving her children better education evaporating. The crisis triggered massive reverse migration. For decades, people had moved from rural areas to cities seeking opportunity and better wages. The flow had been relentless. Farms to factories, villages to Bangkok or Jakarta or Manila. But in late 1997 and 1998, the flow reversed. Urban workers who lost jobs had nowhere to go in the cities. Rents were unaffordable without income. So they returned to their home villages, to family farms they'd left years or decades before. They arrived with nothing, often with spouses and children the village had never met, expecting to be absorbed back into extended families and rural communities. The villages, already poor, struggled to accommodate the returnees. Small family farms that barely supported those already there couldn't feed additional mouths. But family bonds meant no one was turned away. Extended families crowded into small houses. Everyone's standard of living fell as resources were shared more thinly. A Thai man who'd worked in Bangkok for 20 years, who had sent money home to his village throughout that time, returned unemployed. He brought his wife and 2 children. His elderly parents, who had counted on his remittances, now had 3 more people to feed from their small rice farm. The entire family's diet became more meagre. The grandchildren, used to city life, adjusted to rural poverty. Indonesian workers who had migrated to work in Malaysia or the Middle East returned home as jobs disappeared abroad. They came back to villages in Java or Sumatra, carrying savings that had seemed substantial in good times, but evaporated quickly in crisis. The remittances they had sent home, which many villages depended on, stopped flowing. The reverse migration overwhelmed rural areas. Village schools, already underfunded, faced increasing enrollment. Health clinics ran out of medicine. The social services that existed in cities, however inadequate, largely didn't exist in rural areas. People were worse off than before they'd left. Families broke apart in multiple ways. Some men, unable to face unemployment or unable to provide for their families, simply left. They disappeared, sometimes to look for work elsewhere. Sometimes because the shame of failure was unbearable. Women and children were abandoned to fend for themselves. Extended families that had been intact for generations fragmented. Adult children who couldn't find work became burdens on aging parents who had counted on them for support in old age. The traditional expectation, children would care for parents, reversed or collapsed entirely. Neither generation could support the other. elderly people face particular hardship. Many had no pensions or savings, having counted on children's support. But with children unemployed or struggling themselves, the elderly were sometimes neglected or abandoned. There were reports of old people living alone, barely surviving, too proud to beg but unable to work. The crisis also revealed and intensified gender inequalities. Women who lost jobs found it harder to get new ones than men. Domestic service jobs, which many women relied on, disappeared. At the same time, as families' economic situations deteriorated, women often bore additional burdens, managing shrinking household budgets, taking on informal work, caring for children and elderly relatives. Young women, desperate for income, sometimes turned to sex work. The 1990s had seen trafficking and prostitution increase across Southeast Asia, and the crisis accelerated this. Families in deep poverty sometimes sent daughters to cities, knowing or half knowing what work they'd end up doing, because the money they'd send back meant survival for others. The informal economy exploded as formal employment disappeared. Street vending proliferated. In Bangkok, Jakarta, Manila, Seoul, sidewalks filled with vendors selling food, cigarettes, small goods, anything that might bring in a few baht or rupiah or won. Some were people who had never worked informally before. Middle-class professionals reduced to hawking goods on corners. Competition was fierce. A Jakarta man who lost his office job tried selling cigarettes on the street. But 10 other men were selling cigarettes on the same block, all desperate for sales, all undercutting each other's prices. The earnings were minimal, barely enough for rice and basics, but it was something. Informal lending and borrowing increased. Without access to formal banking, people borrowed from family, friends, neighbours, loan sharks. Interest rates were often usurious. But people had no choice. A Thai woman borrowed money from a neighbourhood money lender at 50% monthly interest to pay for her child's medicine. She knew she'd likely never be able to repay the debt fully, but her child needed the medicine now. Barter re-emerged in some areas. People traded services or goods because cash was scarce. A Korean family might trade kimchi they'd made for vegetables from a neighbour, or exchange tutoring for household repairs. These informal exchanges sustained people, but reflected the breakdown of the monetary economy. Education was interrupted for millions of young people. University students, midway through degrees, had to drop out when families could no longer afford tuition. Years of study abandoned, loans taken for education becoming burdens without the credential that would make them worthwhile. A Malaysian student in her 3rd year of university studying engineering received a letter from her parents saying they couldn't send money anymore. Her father had lost his job. She withdrew from university, returned home, the dream of becoming an engineer postponed indefinitely, probably forever. Study abroad became impossible for students who had been accepted to universities in America or Australia. Britain. The cost in local currency had doubled or tripled as currencies collapsed. Families that had saved for years to send a child overseas found their savings insufficient. Students already abroad, dependent on remittances, had to return home before completing degrees. Even primary and secondary education suffered. School fees that had been affordable became unaffordable. Children were pulled from school to work, helping families survive. Child labour increased. Children working in markets, in fields, in small factories, earning pittances but contributing to family income. The long-term impact on human capital was enormous. An entire cohort of young people had their education interrupted. The skills they might have developed, the knowledge they might have gained, the contributions they might have made, all lost or delayed. Health impacts rippled through the affected countries. Medicine, much of it imported, became unaffordable as currencies collapsed. A diabetic in Indonesia who needed insulin found the price quintupled. Families had to choose, buy medicine or buy food. Often medicine lost because you can't feed a family with medicine, but you might survive another day without it. Hospitals in public systems were overwhelmed. Equipment broke and couldn't be replaced. Supplies ran out. Staff were overworked and underpaid. A Bangkok hospital nurse watched her real salary fall by half due to inflation, while her workload doubled as more people sought free public care. Malnutrition increased, particularly among children and the elderly. Rice and basic starches might be available, but protein, fruits, vegetables became luxuries. Children's development suffered. Elderly people's health deteriorated. Maternal health declined as pregnant women couldn't afford prenatal care or proper nutrition. Preventable diseases increased. Vaccination programs were disrupted. Tuberculosis, which had been declining, started increasing again. Waterborne diseases increased as families cut corners on sanitation to save money. Mental health was a silent catastrophe. Depression rates soared. Anxiety became endemic. But mental health services barely existed, and the stigma around mental illness meant people suffered in silence. A Korean businessman who lost everything to bankruptcy sat alone in his apartment contemplating suicide, too ashamed to seek help, feeling he had dishonored his family and himself. Substance abuse increased as people sought escape from despair. Alcohol consumption rose. Drug use increased. These weren't causes of the crisis, but consequences of the psychological damage it inflicted. The sheer scale of human suffering is hard to fully capture. Tens of millions of people saw their lives derailed, their plans destroyed, their security evaporate. Each person's story was unique in its details, but similar in its arc. From stability or modest prosperity to struggle and uncertainty, from confidence to fear, from hope to desperation. Yet within all this suffering, there was also resilience, adaptation, community. People found ways to survive that governments and economists hadn't planned for. Families shared resources, neighbours helped neighbours. Informal networks of support emerged or strengthened. The human capacity to endure, to find meaning and connection even in hardship, was visible everywhere. A Thai street vendor who had lost everything started each day at dawn, setting up her cart, preparing food, serving customers with a smile, because what else could she do but persist? Her life hadn't turned out as she'd hoped, but she was surviving, feeding her children, maintaining dignity. A Korean father who'd lost his white-collar job took manual labour work that would have seemed beneath him before. The work was hard, the pay minimal, but it was honest work and it helped feed his family. He swallowed his pride and did what needed to be done. An Indonesian mother whose husband had disappeared stretched a handful of rice and vegetables to feed 4 children. She made it work through sheer determination and creativity. Her children might go to bed hungry, but they went to bed, and tomorrow she'd figure out how to feed them again. These small acts of survival, repeated millions of times across the region, were the human response to catastrophe. Not heroic in the grand sense, but heroic in the everyday sense of people refusing to give up, finding strength they didn't know they had, protecting what they loved even when almost everything else was lost. Let that rest with you, the weight of so much suffering, but also the persistence of so much strength. The crisis hurt millions, but it didn't break everyone. People survived, they adapted, they endured, and eventually, slowly, they would begin to rebuild. As people across Asia struggled to survive, as families made impossible choices, as the human cost mounted, international institutions were mobilizing what they believed was rescue. The International Monetary Fund, along with the World Bank and wealthy nations, assembled bailout packages that were unprecedented in their size, but whether these packages helped or hurt, whether they were medicine or poison, remains debated even decades later. Let's understand what the IMF is, because its role in the crisis was central and controversial. The International Monetary Fund was created in 1944, near the end of World War II, as part of the Bretton Woods system designed to manage the global economy and prevent another Great Depression. The idea was to create an institution that could help countries experiencing balance of payments problems, situations where a country was running out of foreign currency to pay for imports or service debts. The IMF would lend money to countries in crisis, giving them breathing room to stabilize their economies and implement reforms. In exchange for these loans, countries would agree to conditions, policy changes designed to address the underlying problems that caused the crisis. This was called conditionality, and it was built into the IMF's mission from the beginning. By 1997, the IMF had been involved in numerous crises, in Latin America in the 1980s, in Mexico in 1994 to 95, in various African countries over decades. It had developed what it believed were best practices, lessons learned from previous crises about what worked and what didn't. When the Asian crisis erupted, the IMF was the institution the world turned to. It had the resources, the expertise, the mandate to respond. Between August of 1997 and December of that year, it assembled rescue packages for Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea. The numbers were staggering, reflecting both the severity of the crisis and the size of the economies involved. Thailand was first, receiving a package totaling $17.2 billion in August of 1997. The IMF provided $4 billion, with the rest coming from the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and bilateral contributions from Japan, Australia, and other countries. For Thailand, with an economy of about $150 billion, this was substantial support. Indonesia's package, announced in November and later expanded, eventually totaled $43 billion. The IMF contributed roughly $10 billion, with the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and bilateral donors providing the rest. This was the second largest rescue package in IMF history at the time. South Korea's package, announced in December, was the largest ever, $57 billion in total commitments. The IMF pledged $21 billion, with the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and bilateral support from the United States, Japan, and others making up the difference. For the 11th largest economy in the world, facing possible sovereign default, this enormous sum was deemed necessary. But the money came with strings attached. Strict conditions, structural adjustment, in the language of international development, though critics would use harsher terms. The conditions varied by country but followed common themes. Countries had to close insolvent banks and finance companies immediately. They had to raise interest rates sharply to defend their currencies and restore confidence. They had to cut government spending and reduce budget deficits. They had to restructure their financial sectors, strengthen regulation and supervision. They had to end monopolies and preferential treatment for connected businesses. They had to open their markets to more foreign investment and ownership. They had to make labour markets more flexible, making it easier to hire and fire workers. In Korea's case, the conditions required dismantling or reforming the chaebol system, breaking up the conglomerates, ending government-directed lending, forcing transparency in corporate governance. In Indonesia, it meant closing banks, ending fuel subsidies, dismantling Suharto family monopolies. In Thailand, it meant shutting finance companies and reforming the banking sector. The IMF's rationale for these conditions was based on its understanding of what had caused the crisis and what was needed to restore confidence and create sustainable growth. From the IMF's perspective, these Asian economies had fundamental structural problems. The banking systems were weak, riddled with bad loans made for political rather than economic reasons. The corporate sectors were over-leveraged and unprofitable. Government intervention distorted markets and created inefficiencies. Crony capitalism meant resources were allocated based on connections rather than merit. These structural problems had made the countries vulnerable to crisis, and fixing them was necessary for recovery. The high interest rates, while painful, were seen as necessary to stop capital flight and stabilize currencies. If interest rates stayed low, money would continue flowing out, currencies would keep falling, making the crisis worse. Only by making it expensive to bet against the currency, by rewarding those who kept money in the country, could the bleeding be stopped. The fiscal austerity, cutting government spending, was meant to reassure international lenders that governments were serious about reform, that they wouldn't just spend bailout money on wasteful projects or prop up failing cronies. Balanced budgets would restore confidence. The structural reforms, opening markets, ending monopolies, reforming banks, would create more efficient, competitive economies that could grow sustainably, rather than relying on unsustainable borrowing and speculation. This was the IMF's theory. Whether it worked in practice was another question entirely. The immediate effects of the IMF programs were, almost universally, to make the crisis worse before making it better. High interest rates, while potentially stabilizing currencies, crushed businesses. Small and medium enterprises that were fundamentally sound but needed credit to operate found themselves unable to borrow. The cost of capital became prohibitive. Companies that might have survived with normal interest rates failed under rates of 20, 30, 40% or higher. A Thai textile manufacturer with export orders, with customers who wanted to buy his products, couldn't get financing for raw materials because interest rates were so high that borrowing was impossible. He had to lay off his workers and shut down, not because his business was bad, but because the cost of credit was unsustainable. The fiscal austerity, cutting government spending just when the economy was contracting, deepened recessions. In normal times, when an economy slows, governments typically increase spending to stimulate demand. But the IMF was requiring the opposite, spending cuts during recession. This seemed to many economists to be exactly backward. Public sector workers lost jobs or had salaries cut. Infrastructure projects halted. Social services were reduced just when people needed them most. The human cost was immediate and severe. Closing banks and finance companies, while perhaps necessary to clean up the financial system, triggered bank runs and panic that spread to healthy institutions. In Indonesia, the closure of 16 banks caused depositors at other banks to panic, worsening the crisis rather than containing it. The structural reforms, even when they made long-term sense, were disruptive in the short term. Ending fuel subsidies in Indonesia meant ordinary people faced sharply higher costs for cooking fuel and transportation. Breaking up monopolies put people out of work. Opening markets to foreign competition threatened domestic industries. Within months of the IMF program's beginning, the affected economies sank deeper into recession. GDP contracted sharply, by over 10% in Thailand and Indonesia, by nearly 7% in Korea in 1998. Unemployment soared. The suffering we described in the previous chapter intensified rather than eased. Critics emerged quickly and their voices grew louder as the program's effects became clear. Joseph Stiglitz, who was chief economist at the World Bank at the time, became one of the most prominent critics. He argued that the IMF was applying a one-size-fits-all approach that didn't fit Asian realities. The prescriptions that might work for Latin American countries with different problems weren't appropriate for Asia. Stiglitz and others pointed out that the Asian crisis wasn't caused by government overspending or excessive inflation, the usual problems the IMF dealt with. These countries had budget surpluses and low inflation. The problem was private sector overborrowing and weak financial regulation. So why require fiscal austerity when government finances weren't the problem? The high interest rate policy was particularly criticised. In a banking crisis, high rates made it harder for businesses to repay loans, which increased bank failures, which deepened the crisis. It was self-defeating. Better to let currencies adjust and focus on recapitalising banks and supporting viable businesses. Critics also argued the IMF was pushing a Western, free market ideology rather than genuinely trying to help. The requirements to open markets, privatise state enterprises, end industrial policy. These served Western business interests by forcing Asian countries to give foreign companies greater access. The crisis was being used to force economic changes that these countries wouldn't have accepted otherwise. The social costs were ignored or minimised, critics said. The IMF focused on financial stability and investor confidence, while ordinary people bore the burden of adjustment. The wealthy and connected often found ways to protect themselves. moving money offshore before the crisis hit, receiving favourable treatment in bailouts, while the poor and middle class suffered. Some critics went further, arguing the IMF programs actually caused crises to become worse than they would have been otherwise. The panic and instability the programs created, the deep recessions they induced, the social upheaval they triggered, all of this was unnecessary, destructive, a cure worse than the disease. But the IMF and its defenders pushed back against these criticisms, arguing that while the medicine was bitter, it was necessary. The IMF's position was that these countries had no choice. They had run out of foreign currency reserves. They faced imminent default on sovereign debt. Without IMF support, complete economic collapse was possible. Banking systems failing entirely, governments unable to function, hyperinflation, social breakdown beyond what actually occurred. The high interest rates, yes, they hurt, but they stopped the currency freefall. If currencies had continued plummeting, the inflation from import prices would have been devastating, and the real value of debts would have spiraled beyond any hope of payment. Stabilizing currencies, however painful, was necessary. The structural reforms weren't punishment, defenders argued, but overdue corrections. The crony capitalism, the weak banking systems, the moral hazard of too big to fail conglomerates, these problems had created the crisis. Fixing them was necessary for sustainable recovery. Moreover, the IMF pointed out, it was lending billions of dollars. It had a responsibility to its member countries, whose taxpayers were ultimately backing these loans, to ensure the money was used productively, not thrown into a failing system that wouldn't reform. Conditionality protected the integrity of the institution and ensured resources weren't wasted. The debate between critics and defenders often became ideological, with underlying disagreements about the proper role of government in the economy, about whether markets should be regulated or freed, about whether development required state guidance or market discipline. Malaysia under Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad chose a different path, and watching Malaysia's experience became a test case for the broader debate about the IMF approach. Mahathir, as we discussed earlier, was furious about the crisis, blaming currency speculators and Western financial institutions. When Malaysia's crisis deepened through 1997 and into 1998, he refused to accept IMF help, rejecting both the money and the conditions. Instead, in September of 1998, Malaysia imposed capital controls. The ringgit was pegged to the dollar at a fixed rate of 3.8 to 1. Money couldn't freely flow in and out of Malaysia. Investors wanting to withdraw money had to wait a year, then could withdraw with restrictions. This was the opposite of what the IMF recommended, which was open capital markets. Malaysia also pursued expansionary fiscal policy, increasing government spending rather than cutting it. To stimulate the economy, interest rates were lowered rather than raised. State banks provided credit to businesses on favourable terms. The government directly intervened to support industries and maintain employment. The international financial community was horrified. Mahathir was defying economic orthodoxy. They said, capital controls would scare away investment forever. Malaysia would be shut out of international markets. The policy would fail, and Malaysia would eventually have to accept IMF help on even harsher terms. But Malaysia's economy stabilised and began recovering. The ringgit peg held. Growth resumed in 1999. Unemployment didn't rise as high as in neighbouring countries. The social costs, while real, were less severe than in Thailand or Indonesia. Whether Malaysia's alternative approach worked better than the IMF programs is complicated. Malaysia's crisis was less severe than Indonesia's or Thailand's to begin with. It had stronger institutions, less foreign debt, more foreign reserves. So perhaps it would have recovered anyway, with or without capital controls. Moreover, Malaysia benefited from the global economic recovery that began in 1999, driven by continued growth in the United States and eventual stabilisation of the Asian crisis countries. Rising tide lifted Malaysia along with its neighbours. Still, Malaysia's experience suggested that the IMF approach wasn't the only possible response, that countries had choices about how to manage crises, that capital controls and expansionary policy could work under certain circumstances. The debate over Malaysia, like the broader debate over the IMF programs, never reached a clear resolution. Both sides claimed vindication. Both pointed to evidence supporting their views. What's perhaps most striking looking back is how uncertain the right response was. The IMF prescribed what it genuinely believed would work, based on its experience in economic theory. But economic crises are complex, and theories don't always match reality. The same policies might work in one context and fail in another. The people making these decisions, IMF officials, finance ministers, central bankers, weren't villains. They were trying to stop catastrophic crisis with imperfect information and limited tools. They made mistakes, certainly. Whether the mistakes were avoidable is harder to say. For the people living through the crisis, the academic debates about optimal policy were abstract. What mattered was whether they could feed their families, whether they had jobs, whether recovery was coming. The IMF programs, whatever their theoretical merits, were experienced as adding hardship in the short term, with uncertain long-term benefits. A Korean worker laid off because his company couldn't afford high interest rates didn't care whether the policy was theoretically sound. He cared that he was unemployed. An Indonesian mother watching fuel prices triple didn't care whether subsidy removal made economic sense. She cared that she couldn't afford to cook meals for her children. The human cost of the programs was real, immediate, and severe. Whether that cost was necessary, whether a different approach might have reduced suffering while still achieving recovery, whether the long-term benefits justified the short-term pain, these are questions that even now, decades later, don't have simple answers. What's clear is that the 1997 crisis and the IMF response changed how people thought about international financial institutions, about globalization, about who benefits and who pays when crisis comes. Trust in Western economic models was shaken. The assumption that international institutions acted in everyone's best interest was questioned. The crisis politicized economics in ways that lasted long after recovery. Let these debates rest in your mind. The complexity, the uncertainty, the gap between theory and lived experience, the difficult truth that sometimes there are no good choices, only less bad ones. The IMF tried to help, by its own lights. Whether it succeeded or failed, whether it eased suffering or deepened it, depends partly on how you measure success and partly on which evidence you weigh most heavily. Recovery, when it finally came slowly. Not as a sudden reversal, not as a triumphant return to prosperity, but as a gradual easing of the worst pressures, a stabilization that allowed people to begin rebuilding what had been lost. The turning point came in early 1999. Though no one could quite identify a single moment when things shifted, it was more like the tide turning, imperceptible at first but eventually undeniable. Currencies stopped falling and began stabilizing at their new lower levels. The Thai baht, which had collapsed from 25 per dollar to over 50, steadied around 40 and gradually strengthened to the mid-30s. The Korean won, which had spiked above 1,700 per dollar, recovered to around 1,200. The Indonesian rupiah, after its catastrophic fall to over 16,000 per dollar, stabilized around 8,000 to 10,000. Still much weaker than before the crisis, but no longer in free fall. This currency stabilization was crucial. It allowed businesses to plan again. When you don't know what the exchange rate will be tomorrow, you can't make decisions about pricing, about purchasing, about investment. But when currencies stopped their violent swings, even at much weaker levels than before, economic activity could resume. Stock markets began recovering from their lows, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. The Thai stock market, which had fallen from over 1,400 points to below 400, climbed back above 500, then 600. The Korean market recovered even more quickly, helped by the country's rapid restructuring. These weren't returns to previous highs that would take years, but they represented moving in the right direction. Foreign investment, which had fled so rapidly during the crisis, began returning. Not a flood, but a trickle that gradually increased. Investors who had pulled money out in panic began seeing opportunities in cheap assets, in currencies that had fallen so far they seemed unlikely to fall further, in economies that were implementing reforms. Export growth resumed, helped by the cheaper currencies that made Asian goods more competitive in global markets. A Thai furniture manufacturer found that his products, priced in weak baht, were suddenly attractive to American buyers again. Orders increased. He could rehire some of the workers he'd laid off. Production resumed. The global economy also helped. The United States was in the midst of a technology boom, with strong growth and rising demand for imports. This created markets for Asian exports. Japan, while still struggling with its own long stagnation, wasn't getting worse. Europe was growing. The external environment was supportive rather than hostile, but the recovery was far from uniform. Different countries recovered at different speeds, and within each country, the benefits of recovery were distributed unevenly. South Korea recovered fastest. A testament both to its underlying strengths and to the thoroughness of its restructuring, the Chaebol were forced to reform, reducing debt, shedding unprofitable businesses, improving corporate governance. Banks were recapitalized, with the government spending enormous sums to clean up bad loans and strengthen balance sheets. By 2000, Korea's GDP was growing again. By 2001, it had recovered to pre-crisis levels. Korean workers who had lost jobs in the crisis found new employment, though often at lower wages or in different industries than before. A former Daewoo worker might find himself at a smaller company or in a service sector job rather than manufacturing. The lifetime employment system was gone, but employment was returning. Thailand and Malaysia recovered at moderate pace. Thailand's economy began growing again in 2000, though the growth was slower than the boom years. The banking sector had been cleaned up, with many bad loans written off or restructured. The real estate market stabilized at much lower prices, then gradually began recovering. Tourism returned. Visitors from Europe and Asia came back to Thai beaches and temples. Malaysia, which had pursued its independent path with capital controls, saw recovery at similar speed to Thailand. The capital controls were gradually eased starting in 1999, and by 2001 they were largely removed. Whether the controls had helped or hurt was debated, but Malaysia had avoided the deepest catastrophe and was growing again. The Philippines, which had been hit less severely, recovered at a moderate pace as well. Its relatively lower foreign debt and more conservative banking sector meant it had less damage to repair. Indonesia recovered most slowly and incompletely. The political transformation, Suharto's fall, the transition to democracy, created both opportunities and instabilities. The economy began growing again in 2000, but growth was fragile, interrupted by political uncertainties and regional conflicts. The rupiah remained weak for years. Living standards for many Indonesians didn't return to pre-crisis levels for most of a decade. Within each country, the recovery was uneven by class and region. Those who had lost everything, savings wiped out, homes foreclosed, businesses bankrupted, often couldn't recover what they'd lost. A Thai banker who had been forced to sell his condo at a loss during the crisis, who had been unemployed for 2 years, might find a new job by 2000, but he'd never rebuild his savings. His trajectory had been permanently altered. The wealthy and connected often recovered quickly. They'd been able to move money offshore before the worst of the crisis. They had access to the best opportunities, buying assets cheaply during the crisis, benefiting disproportionately when recovery came. Inequality, which the boom years had partially reduced, increased during and after the crisis. Permanent changes reshaped the economic and political landscape of Asia. The currency pegs were abandoned everywhere except Hong Kong, which maintained its currency board system. Thailand, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, the Philippines all moved to floating exchange rate regimes. Central banks no longer promised to defend specific rates. Currencies would find their levels in markets, rising and falling based on economic fundamentals and investor sentiment. This was a fundamental shift. For decades, stable exchange rates had seemed essential to Asian economic models. The crisis proved that defending unsustainable pegs could be catastrophic. Better to let currencies adjust than to spend all your reserves defending the indefensible. Banking regulation was strengthened dramatically across the region. The crisis had exposed how weak supervision and connected lending had created fragility. New regulations required higher capital ratios, better risk management, more transparency. Some poorly managed banks were allowed to fail or were forced to merge with stronger institutions. Foreign banks were allowed greater entry, bringing competition and expertise. Korean chaebol reforms, while incomplete, did change the conglomerate system. Debt-to-equity ratios were reduced. Cross-shareholding between affiliates was limited. Independent board members were required. Transparency increased. The largest chaebol like Samsung emerged stronger but more disciplined. Others, like Daewoo, were broken up entirely. Corporate governance improved throughout the region. The crisis had shown how opaque ownership structures and poor governance led to bad decision-making and made it impossible for investors to assess risk properly. New requirements for disclosure, for shareholder rights, for accounting standards made Asian companies more transparent and eventually more attractive to international investors. Political changes were profound in some countries. Indonesia's transformation from Suharto's authoritarian rule to messy but genuine democracy was the most dramatic. Elections in 1999 brought the first democratically chosen president. The military's political role was reduced. Press freedom increased. Civil society strengthened. The democratization was imperfect, but real. South Korea's democracy deepened through the crisis. Kim Dae-jung's election and the peaceful transfer of power to an opposition figure during crisis showed democratic resilience. Subsequent reforms strengthened democratic institutions and reduced corruption, though challenges remained. Thailand experienced political turbulence that would continue for years, but civil society became more active and critical of government. The crisis politicized many Thais who had previously been passive, creating demands for accountability that would shape politics for decades. But alongside political and economic changes, social scars remained, wounds that wouldn't heal for a generation or more. The generation that lost years of education faced permanent disadvantage. A Thai student who had to drop out of university in 1997 might eventually return to finish a degree, but the interruption meant delayed career entry, lower lifetime earnings, opportunities missed. Or perhaps she never returned. And the incomplete degree became a marker of lost potential. Families broken apart by the crisis sometimes reunited as conditions improved but often didn't. A father who had left in shame when unemployment overwhelmed him might never return, even when jobs became available. Children grew up without fathers, carrying that absence into adulthood. Trust in institutions had been damaged in ways that couldn't be easily repaired. A generation learned not to trust banks fully, not to trust that governments could or would protect them from economic catastrophe, not to believe promises of permanent prosperity. This skepticism, while perhaps healthy in moderation, could curdle into cynicism that made collective action harder. The psychological trauma persisted. Middle-aged Koreans who lived through the IMF crisis carried that experience as defining memory, shaping how they saved, how they thought about debt, how they raised their children. Even when they achieved financial security again, the fear of losing it remained. Attitudes toward debt and saving changed permanently. The pre-crisis culture of borrowing to consume or invest was replaced by caution. People saved more, borrowed less. Prioritized security over growth. This was individually rational, but collectively meant slower economic growth than might have been possible. Yet from the trauma came determination that such a crisis must never happen again, and this determination led to one of the most significant long-term consequences of the crisis: the massive accumulation of foreign currency reserves. Asian countries, having learned the hard way that running out of reserves meant accepting humiliating IMF bailouts, resolved to build enormous reserve cushions. They ran current account surpluses, exporting more than they imported, and used the dollars they earned to build reserves rather than to consume or invest domestically. South Korea's reserves, which had been dangerously depleted in late 1997, were rebuilt rapidly. By 2005, Korea had over $200 billion in reserves. Thailand, which had spent most of its reserves defending the baht, rebuilt to well over $50 billion. Even Indonesia, despite its slower recovery, accumulated reserves. China, watching the crisis from the sidelines, learned lessons too. Chinese leaders saw what happened when countries couldn't defend their currencies, when they had to accept IMF conditionality. China resolved that it would never be in that position. It maintained tight capital controls and accumulated reserves on a scale that dwarfed even Korea's, eventually reaching over $3 trillion. This reserve accumulation created global imbalances that would have consequences for decades. Asian countries were saving enormous amounts, buying US Treasury bonds and other safe assets, while the United States was borrowing and consuming. These imbalances would contribute to the global financial crisis of 2008, though that's another story. Regional cooperation also strengthened as Asian countries sought to reduce dependence on Western-dominated institutions like the IMF. In May of 2000, the finance ministers of ASEAN countries plus China, Japan and South Korea met in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and agreed to create a network of bilateral currency swap agreements. The Chiang Mai Initiative, as it became known, would allow countries to borrow foreign currency from each other in times of stress, reducing dependence on the IMF. The initiative started small and took years to become operational, but it represented a shift. Asian countries taking collective responsibility for regional financial stability, rather than relying entirely on global institutions. There was discussion of creating an Asian monetary fund, a regional alternative to the IMF that would understand Asian economies better and impose less harsh conditionality. Japan proposed this idea, but it was ultimately blocked by the United States and the IMF, who feared it would undermine global financial governance. Still, the discussion showed how the crisis had changed thinking about regional cooperation. The Asian Development Bank, based in Manila, took on an expanded role in supporting development and infrastructure investment across the region. Regional trade agreements proliferated. The sense of shared Asian identity, of common interest distinct from Western perspectives, strengthened. For individual people, recovery was personal, gradual, often incomplete. A Korean office worker who had lost his job in 1998 found new employment in 2001. The job paid less than his previous position, and he'd lost years of seniority, but it was stable work and allowed him to support his family again. He'd sold his car during the crisis and couldn't afford to buy another. He'd withdrawn his children from piano lessons and they never resumed. His dreams of an international vacation were permanently shelved, but he was employed, his family was fed and housed, and that was enough. Recovery for him looked like modest security rather than prosperity, but compared to the depths of the crisis, it felt like victory. A Thai construction worker who had returned to his village in 1997 came back to Bangkok in 2000 when construction resumed. He found work on projects rebuilding the city's infrastructure. The pay was decent, better than farming. He sent money home again. His children could attend school. The years in the village had been hard, but his family had survived, and now life was improving again. An Indonesian small business owner who'd gone bankrupt during the crisis started over in 2002, opening a small shop with borrowed money. The debt was substantial and the interest high, but customers were returning, the economy was growing, and she believed she could make it work. The business she'd built over 20 years was gone forever. That loss could never be recovered. But she could build something new, smaller but hers. These individual recoveries, multiplied across millions of people, were the real substance of regional recovery. Not the GDP statistics or stock market indices, important as those were, but people rebuilding lives, finding work, educating children, slowly regaining the security and dignity that crisis had stolen. Not everyone recovered. Some people's losses were permanent. The elderly person whose life savings disappeared never rebuilt them. There wasn't time left. The student whose education was interrupted never completed it. The business owner who lost everything lacked the energy or resources to start again. Recovery was real and widespread, but it wasn't universal. The region by 2005 looked transformed compared to 1997. Economies were growing again, many at impressive rates. The immediate crisis was over. Buildings that had stood half-finished for years were completed or demolished. Banks that had closed were gone, replaced by stronger institutions. Stock markets had recovered much of their losses. But the region was also permanently changed from what it had been in the mid-90s. The unbounded optimism was gone, replaced by cautious confidence. The faith in rapid, debt-fueled growth was tempered by memory of how quickly it could collapse. The assumption that Asian economic models were superior to Western ones was complicated by the reality that Asia had needed Western bailouts. Political systems were more democratic, more accountable in Indonesia and Korea, though challenges remained everywhere. Economies were more market-oriented, with less government direction and more foreign participation. Social safety nets, almost non-existent before the crisis, had been created or strengthened in response to the suffering the crisis caused. The crisis had been a brutal teacher, but Asia had learned. The lessons about financial stability, about the dangers of excessive debt, about the need for reserves and regulation, these lessons were taken to heart. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, Asian countries were prepared in ways they hadn't been in 1997. They had reserves to cushion the blow, their banks were stronger, they recovered more quickly than the West. The 1997 crisis became a marker in Asian history, a before and after. Those who lived through it divided their lives accordingly. Before the crisis, when optimism reigned. After the crisis, when caution prevailed. The miracle years were over, but something more sustainable, if less spectacular, had been built in their place. Let that transformation settle, the slow climb from catastrophe back to stability, the permanent changes both necessary and unwelcome, the individual struggles and victories, the collective learning through suffering. Asia had been tested, had failed in some ways and endured in others, and had emerged different but not broken. And so, we've travelled together through the 1997 crisis, from the gleaming heights of the Asian miracle, through the collapse, through the months of suffering and slow recovery, to the lasting changes it created. We've walked with the people who lost everything and rebuilt, who endured what seemed unbearable and somehow persisted. What remains with us isn't the currency rates or the bailout numbers, but something deeper. The understanding that prosperity is fragile, that what seems permanent can vanish, that we're all vulnerable to forces larger than ourselves, but also that people are stronger than they know, that communities endure, that even from catastrophe, recovery eventually comes. Wherever you are right now, in whatever time you're watching from, let your body sink a little deeper. The crisis is long past. Those who suffered have mostly rebuilt their lives or found peace. The lessons remain, woven into how we understand economies and ourselves. Look up at the stars if you can, or imagine them. Those same stars shone over Bangkok and Jakarta and Seoul during the darkest nights of 1997. They witnessed everything and outlasted it all. There's comfort in that perspective, in knowing that suffering ends, that morning follows night, that nothing, however terrible, lasts forever. Sleep well, dream of better times. Good night, wherever you are.